Night settles over Rome like a velvet cloak, the city breathing in hushed silence after the tumult of day. But within the walls of Vatican City, where marble corridors echo with centuries of footsteps, silence is never truly empty. In the shadows of torchlit passageways and beneath gilded ceilings, whispers have long drifted like smoke, elusive and ungraspable. They speak not of the Pope in his white cassock who greets pilgrims from a balcony, but of another figure, darker, hidden, feared. They speak of a man whose power is said to stretch invisibly across nations, a figure the world has come to call the Black Pope. The Vatican is no ordinary state. It is at once the smallest nation in the world and the seat of spiritual power for over 1 billion souls. Its walls have witnessed the coronations of saints and the schemes of sinners, the prayers of the humble and the politics of emperors. And yet, for all its pageantry and ceremony, for all the open displays of devotion in St. Peter's Square, there remains a lingering suspicion that another current flows beneath the surface, a subterranean river of influence not seen but deeply felt. Who truly commands the Vatican? Is a visible pope merely the light while another figure, shrouded in black, works in the dark corridors, pulling unseen strings? The legend of the Black Pope does not begin with a document or decree, but with murmurs from diplomats, whispers in courtrooms, accusations hurled by enemies of Rome. He is not listed among the cardinals, nor does he sit upon the golden throne. Instead, he wears the simple black robes of a priest, blending in unremarkable. And yet, this anonymity is what fuels the myth. For some, he is the most dangerous man alive, more powerful than the Pope himself, and far more elusive. Imagine yourself wandering through the Vatican library at night, where manuscripts lie hidden in locked cabinets, scrolls written in faded ink centuries ago. Among these secrets are letters from kings and queens, confessing their sins and revealing their schemes to men who served not Rome's pontiff in white, but the leader of the Jesuit Order, the man forever cloaked in black. In those letters lies a truth that is as intoxicating as it is frightening. Influence is not always exercised in the light of day. It is whispered, it is suggested, it is pressed upon a conscience in the silence of confession. The Jesuit Superior General. This is a man the world has dubbed the Black Pope. To his followers, he is not a sinister figure but a leader of spiritual soldiers, bound to Christ through obedience. But to his enemies, he is a spectre of control, a manipulator cloaked in sanctity, ruling not by force of arms, but by the subtler weapons of knowledge, persuasion, and loyalty. He commands no army in the traditional sense, and yet his men are everywhere, in universities, in missions, in palaces, and in parliaments. Wherever ideas shape nations, the Jesuit is present. Wherever secrets are spoken, his loyal to him may be listening. The mystery of the Black Pope thrives because it lies between fact and faith. On one hand, the Jesuits are teachers, missionaries, and defenders of the faith. On the other, they have been accused of plots, assassinations, and political manipulation. The tension between their noble vows and the suspicion they inspire is precisely what makes a legend so enduring. Power hidden is power magnified, and the less one can see of it, the greater the imagination fills the void. In the cold hours before dawn, if you listen carefully, the Vatican itself seems to hum with echoes of this invisible authority. The marble pillars that line St. Peter's Basilica have absorbed centuries of secrets. The frescoes of the Sistine Chapel gaze down with knowing silence, as if they have witnessed not just papal conclaves, but also whispered negotiations behind locked doors. Some believe that for every decision made publicly by the Pope, another was influenced or guided privately by the hand of his dark counterpart. It is not proof that convinces believers of the Black Pope's power. It is the absence of proof, the shadows where evidence ought to be, that speak loudest. To begin to unravel the legend, one must first understand the fear that birthed it. Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries was torn by Reformation and war. Monarchs sought allies, rebels sought justification, and the Church itself was under siege. In such times, the presence of a disciplined order, sworn to absolute obedience, capable of infiltrating courts and shaping minds, was enough to terrify both Protestant princes and Catholic kings. And at the center of this order stood one man, the general of the Jesuits. To many, he became not just a leader but the embodiment of unseen dominion. Thus, the myth of the Black Pope was born. But myths are not conjured from thin air. They are rooted in kernels of truth. The Jesuits did wield immense influence. Their confessors did whisper into the ears of monarchs. Their school did shape the minds of future leaders. And so, when whispers spread of a hidden ruler of Rome, it seemed all too plausible. If the Pope in white stood as a shepherd of the faithful, could it be that the man in black was the strategist, the commander, the hand that steered the Church's worldly cause? Picture now the dimly lit office of the Jesuit Superior General in Rome, a modest room compared to the gilded chambers of the Vatican. There are no golden thrones here, no jeweled tiaras, no marble floors. And yet, decisions made within these walls ripple across continents. Missionaries are dispatched, universities founded, debate stirred. If the Pope rules hearts and souls, the Black Pope, as the story goes, rules minds and destinies. The whispers grow darker still when one considers the accusations that never die. Were the Jesuits involved in the assassination of monarchs? Did they orchestrate revolutions in the name of their unseen general? Or were these accusations simply the invention of frightened rulers seeking to explain their own downfall? Each century has added new layers to the myth, and each denial has only deepened the suspicion. The Vatican stands today as both fortress and sanctuary, and within its walls, two figures have long existed side by side. The Pope in white, seen by all, and the Pope in black, glimpsed only in rumor. But perhaps that is where true power resides, not in visibility, but in invisibility. For what we cannot see, we imagine, and what we imagine, we fear. And so, as the bells of St. Peter's toll midnight, echoing across the silent city, one question lingers like incense in the air. Who truly rules the Vatican? The Pope who blesses from a balcony, or the shadow in black who whispers in the walls? The power of a name lies not in syllables, but in the weight of fear it carries. Across the courts of Europe, whispered in secret chambers and written between the lines of royal correspondence, one title stirred unease even among kings and emperors: the Black Pope. It was never an official title, never recognized in Vatican decrees, and yet it possessed a force stronger than any honorific. It was a name that inspired dread precisely because it was not conferred. It was earned, or rather imposed, by those who feared the influence of a man whose authority was not bound by throne or crown. Imagine the grandeur of a 17th-century royal palace. Candles flicker in gilded halls as courtiers gather for a late-night council. War looms on the horizon. Alliances are fragile, and every decision could spell the survival or downfall of a dynasty. Amid the murmurs of generals and ministers, one phrase pierces the air like a dagger. What will the Jesuits say? What does their general command? The monarch, draped in silk and gold, might wield armies of tens of thousands, yet his counselors fear the invisible influence of a man in Rome whose name he may not even dare to utter. That man was known as the Black Pope. The paradox is striking. The Pope in white is revered as a holy father, the spiritual shepherd of Christendom, his image reproduced in paintings and statues, his every movement watched by the faithful. The Black Pope, however, is unseen, his authority exercised not through ceremony but through obedience and secrecy. He wears no tiara, commands no armies, and yet, to the fearful, he is more dangerous than emperors, for his dominion is said to extend into the conscience itself. What king can rule when his very confessor whispers counsel shaped by loyalty to another master? What empire can feel secure when its future leaders are educated by schools that owe allegiance to a man beyond its borders? This was the genius and the terror of the Jesuit system. The superior general commanded not through decrees broadcast to the masses, but through a chain of obedience invisible to the public eye. A Jesuit in Paris or Madrid, a missionary in Asia, a teacher in a distant college, all were bound by vows of absolute loyalty. To enemies, this looked like a perfect web of control, a conspiracy woven with threads of silence and discipline. And at the center of the web stood the figure in black, the general. The name Black Pope therefore carried with it the suggestion of an alternative sovereignty, a hidden monarchy within the Church. History offers glimpses of how powerful this reputation became. In France, Protestant Huguenots accused Jesuits of being the secret engineers of their persecution, whispering that the Black Pope pulled strings behind the Catholic monarch's policies. In England, during the reign of Elizabeth I and later James I, rumors abounded that Jesuits plotted assassinations and invasions. Whenever a dagger flashed or a rebellion rose, suspicion turned not to visible conspirators but to the shadowy figure in Rome. Even when evidence was absent, the myth sufficed. It was easier and more terrifying to believe in a single mind directing chaos than in the messy reality of politics. But kings themselves also feared this title. The monarchs of Spain and Portugal, deeply Catholic and traditionally allied with the Vatican, grew wary of the Jesuits' influence in their colonies. Missionaries converted souls, but also wielded immense influence among indigenous populations, shaping communities and economies. To royal courts, it seemed as though another power, Rome's hidden hand, was planting its flag where their own banners flew. Could the Black Pope be ruling the New World not with soldiers but with catechisms, slowly bending empires toward his own designs? It is telling that this name did not originate from the Vatican itself, but from those who saw the Jesuits as a threat. Protestants, rival clergy, and political enemies crafted it to highlight the contrast with the visible Pope. The Pope in white symbolized light, purity, and open authority. The Pope in black symbolized secrecy, control, and an authority that thrived in shadow. Yet what made the name so enduring was not simply malice. It was the uneasy suspicion that it might be true. The fear of hidden rulers is as old as power itself. Every court, every empire, every nation has faced the rumor that decisions are made not by the man on the throne, but by some unseen hand behind him. In the Vatican, this suspicion found its perfect vessel in the Jesuit superior general. The Society of Jesus had been formed not merely as a religious order, but as a disciplined force, a spiritual army with a command structure that mirrored the strategies of war. It is no wonder that monarchs, accustomed to the visible hierarchies of armies and governments, perceive in the Jesuits a rival army, one armed not with muskets but with ideas, loyalty, and influence. The name Black Pope became both an accusation and a warning. To some, it signified tyranny cloaked in piety. To others, it was a grudging recognition of effectiveness, a dark respect for an organization that could outthink and outmaneuver the greatest powers of Europe. Even writers and philosophers, skeptical of the Church, invoked the title when describing the hidden forces shaping history. It became shorthand for control unseen, for decisions made in whispers rather than proclamations. And yet, the irony is sharp. Within the Jesuit order itself, the superior general is not seen as a tyrant but as a servant. His power is absolute, yes, but it is exercised in the name of obedience, humility, and mission. Jesuits themselves rarely, if ever, refer to him by the dreaded nickname. For them, he is Father General, the one who unites them in their vows. The terrifying title of Black Pope was never embraced from within. It was always thrust upon him by those outside, those who saw in his hidden authority a danger they could neither measure nor control. As centuries passed, the name endured. It leapt from whispers in royal courts to pamphlets distributed in marketplaces, from political speeches to anti-Jesuit propaganda. The very persistence of the title gave it strength. Each generation of Jesuit leaders inherited not only the office, but also the shadow cast by this infamous name. It was as if the office itself carried a curse. No matter the intentions of the man who wore black, the world would always see in him the possibility of dark dominion. By the time the Enlightenment dawned, the Black Pope had become almost a mythological figure, invoked in the same breath as other symbols of secret power, Freemasons, Illuminati, hidden cabals. The man in black robes was no longer simply the head of a religious order. He was a legend, one that terrified kings, troubled philosophers, and fascinated the common people. His power was not merely in what he did, but in what others believed him capable of doing. And so the name lived on. Even today, in the modern era of transparency and media, the title still clings to the office, whispered in documentaries, conspiracy theories, and hushed debates. But its origin remains the same as it was centuries ago, a name born not of official recognition but of fear, suspicion, and the uneasy awareness that sometimes the greatest power is not the one that wears a crown, but the one hidden in shadow. Thus the stage is set. The Black Pope is no longer merely a nickname but a specter in history. Yet to understand why the name carries such weight, one must look deeper, not at what was said of him, but at what bound his followers so tightly to his command. For behind the terrifying title lies the oath that made the Jesuits both revered and reviled. The heart of the Jesuit legend beats in a single word: obedience. To their friends, it is the highest form of discipline, a surrender of self to God's will. To their enemies, it is the darkest oath ever sworn, a vow that erases conscience and binds men to a secret master. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between devotion and fear, but one cannot understand the myth of the Black Pope without first stepping into the chamber where that vow was taken. The Society of Jesus, founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, was unlike any religious order that had come before it. While monks cloistered themselves in silence and prayer, the Jesuits ventured into the world like soldiers of faith. They were trained, educated, and disciplined not simply to preach but to engage in battle, sometimes literal, more often intellectual. The vow of obedience to their superior general was what bound them together, forging them into a spiritual army with a chain of command stronger than steel. To outside eyes, it was this very obedience that seemed sinister. Picture a small chapel, hidden away in a Roman college centuries ago. The flicker of candles dances across the stone walls. A young man kneels before the altar, his voice steady but trembling with intensity. He swears not only the traditional vows of poverty and chastity, but also a special vow unique to the Jesuits, obedience to the Pope in matters of mission. Yet more than that, he swears to obey his superior general as though he were Christ himself. To critics, this language sounded alarming. Could such a vow mean that personal morality, conscience, even loyalty to crown and country was set aside in favor of a single master in black? This fear found fuel in a document that circulated across Europe, the so-called Jesuit Oath. Its origins are murky. Historians debate whether it was ever truly used or whether it was a forgery crafted by enemies of the order. But its words, printed in pamphlets and whispered in taverns, sent shivers down spines. The text accused Jesuits of swearing to infiltrate governments, to disguise themselves, to use deception and violence to defend the Church at all costs. They were said to promise, under penalty of damnation, to plant themselves in courts, universities, and councils, all while reporting back to their general in Rome. Imagine the effect on a Protestant king already wary of Catholic plots when confronted with such words. The Jesuit oath, real or fabricated, painted the picture of a global conspiracy. It suggested that no Jesuit could ever be trusted, that his loyalty was not to the laws of the land but to an invisible ruler cloaked in black. Whether true or not, the very existence of the oath in popular imagination magnified the myth of the Black Pope, for here was apparent proof of his absolute command. And yet, within the Jesuit ranks, obedience was understood differently. To them, it was not sinister but sacrificial. To surrender one's will entirely was not to erase morality but to transcend personal pride. Ignatius of Loyola had written of the Jesuit ideal, to be like a corpse, without resistance, moved only by the command of God through one superior. This was shocking imagery even in the 16th century, and it horrified those outside the order. But for Jesuits, it was the price of unity, the secret to their effectiveness. An army cannot function if each soldier decides for himself when to march. Likewise, the society could not fulfill its mission if each member followed only his personal conscience. Here lies the paradox. The very vow that gave the Jesuits their strength was the same vow that fueled suspicion. Their obedience made them disciplined, efficient, and trusted missionaries. It also made them appear as if they were puppets of a single hidden master. And in politics, perception often matters more than reality. The accusations grew with time. In England, pamphlets warned that Jesuits had sworn oaths to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I. In France, Huguenots accused them of orchestrating massacres. In the Americas, rumors spread that missionaries were less interested in saving souls than in securing influence for their general in Rome. Each of these suspicions, whether grounded in fact or fantasy, fed the legend of the oath. For enemies of the Church, it was a perfect weapon, a secret vow that could never be disproven, because its very secrecy was a proof. The oath became a ghost that haunted every Jesuit, no matter how innocent his work. A Jesuit teaching in a rural school might find parents whispering about his hidden instructions. A Jesuit advising a monarch might be accused of plotting coups. Even today, the alleged oath circulates on conspiracy websites, cited as evidence of a centuries-old plot. That its authenticity is doubtful only adds to its power, for myths thrive not on certainty but on suggestion. But consider for a moment what it meant for a young man to actually take his vows as a Jesuit. He gave up wealth, comfort, even the possibility of choosing his own mission. He surrendered himself to a life that might send him to a remote village in Asia or into the dangerous courts of Europe. This was not the ambition of a schemer, but the surrender of a believer. Yet the shadow of the oath ensured that no matter how noble his sacrifice, suspicion would always cling to him. The Jesuit oath, then, is less about the words themselves and more about the power of secrecy. In an age when kings feared invisible enemies, when religion and politics collided violently, the idea of men bound by an unseen vow to a single superior was terrifying. It made the superior general appear not as a simple priest, but as a commander, a strategist, a hidden monarch whose word could mobilize thousands without a single proclamation. And so, the myth deepened. The Black Pope was not feared merely because of his title or his influence, but because of the whispered oath that bound men to him with absolute loyalty. In this fear, kings and emperors saw the outline of an enemy who could never be bribed, never be swayed, never be broken. As history moved forward, the oath would remain at the center of controversy, resurfacing whenever the Jesuits gained influence or faced oppression. It was the ghost that would not die, the secret that ensured suspicion never faded. And it leads us directly to the next question. If the oath made the Jesuits so powerful, what empire were they truly building under Black Pope command? The 16th century was an age of empires. Spain unfurled its banners across the New World. Portugal carved routes to Asia. England and France fought for dominion over seas and trade. Yet, amid the clash of crowns and the thunder of cannons, another kind of empire was quietly rising, one that had no armies, no fleets, and no flag. It was built not on gold or gunpowder, but on ideas, faith, and loyalty. This was the empire of the Jesuits, and at its heart stood their general, the man whom the world would come to fear as the Black Pope. The Society of Jesus spread with astonishing speed. Within a few decades of their founding, Jesuit could be found in courts and villages, universities, and missions, stretching across continents. They were teachers in Paris, confessors in Madrid, missionaries in Japan, astronomers in China, and explorers in South America. No secular empire could match such a network. For while monarchs ruled over land and subjects, the Jesuits reached into minds and souls. Their empire had no borders, yet it stretched everywhere. Imagine the astonishment of a European king watching as Jesuits sailed across oceans, establishing schools and missions not in the name of Spain or Portugal, but in the name of Christ, and, by extension, in the service of their superior general in Rome. They were citizens of no nation, yet they were loyal with absolute obedience to one man. To allies, this made them invaluable. To rivals, it made them dangerous. For if a Jesuit could walk into a royal palace in Asia or a tribal village in the Amazon and command respect, what limit was there to the reach of his order? Their schools became the backbone of this invisible empire. From Paris to Prague, from Lisbon to Lima, Jesuit colleges trained not only priests but also future rulers, scholars, and thinkers. The young nobleman sent to a Jesuit school might later become a king, minister, or general, but his conscience, shaped in those early years, would always bear the imprint of Jesuit teaching. This was influence deeper than armies could ever achieve. It was power over memory, thought, and identity itself. And then there was a confessional. Monarchs and queens, generals and noblemen, poured out their sins to Jesuit confessors. In those moments of vulnerability, when crowns were set aside and secrets confessed in whispers, the Jesuit was not merely a priest but a counselor, a guide, and, to critics, perhaps a manipulator. What advice was given? What guidance offered? No one outside a confessional would ever know. But the suspicion was irresistible. Through the secrecy of confession, the Black Pope might steer the decisions of thrones themselves. The Jesuits' reach went even further, into realms most people never expected. In China, they served as court astronomers, introducing Western science to the imperial court. In South America, they founded vast missions, entire communities guided by Jesuit ideals, where indigenous peoples lived under a system designed by the order. To some, this was salvation, a chance to protect native cultures from brutal colonial exploitation. To others, it looked alarmingly like a state within a state, an empire carved out of loyalty not to a king or emperor, but to the general of the Jesuits. It was this dual nature, part spiritual mission, part worldly influence, that made their expansion both admired and feared. European monarchs welcomed Jesuit education, yet feared their hold over future rulers. Colonizers praised their work in missions, yet resented the independence of their communities. Rivals in the church respected their learning, yet whispered about their ambition. Wherever Jesuits went, suspicion followed. What made their empire so unusual was that it had no single center, no capital city like Madrid or London. Its true capital was invisible, the chain of obedience that tied every Jesuit, whether in the Amazon jungle or the Chinese court, back to the man in Rome. That unity gave the order a power unlike anything the world had seen. A monarch could lose colonies to rebellion, a general could lose armies to defeat, but the Jesuits' empire was not vulnerable to borders or battlefields. It thrived in the unseen realm of minds, hearts, and souls. To monarchs, this looked like infiltration. To critics, it was nothing less than domination through disguise. Was a Jesuit who taught philosophy in a classroom also planting loyalty to the Black Pope and his students? Was a confessor who heard a king's sins also shaping the future of his policies? The more one asked such questions, the darker the picture became. It seemed as though the Jesuits were not merely part of Christendom. They were creating a parallel Christendom of their own. The suspicion grew sharper with each success. When Jesuit schools produced brilliant thinkers, rivals accused them of manipulating minds. When Jesuits advised monarchs, enemies claimed they were steering entire governments. And when Jesuit missions flourished in faraway lands, colonial powers worried that another authority, an empire within, was being born under their very noses. The power of this invisible empire was not measured in gold or armies, but in loyalty. And loyalty, once bound by oath, is stronger than any law of state. For centuries, men who took the Jesuit vow considered themselves dead to the world and alive only to their mission. To rulers, this was terrifying. How could one compete with such absolute devotion? What king could command the loyalty that the Black Pope seemed to command over thousands scattered across the globe? By the late 16th century, it was already clear. The Jesuits had become a force unlike any other. Their empire did not rise in defiance of Rome, but alongside it, within it, beneath it. To many, it seemed as though a second Vatican existed, one visible, one invisible. And if the Pope in white stood for spiritual authority, the Pope in black seemed to hold the levers of influence that reached into every corner of the world. This perception, whether fair or exaggerated, set the stage for centuries of suspicion. For as their empire grew stronger, so did the fears of kings and popes alike. If an invisible hand could shape nations, what might it also destroy? And if loyalty to the general rivaled loyalty to crown or country, could the Jesuits truly be trusted? Thus the legend deepened. An empire within an empire, commanded not from a throne but from the shadows. It was not merely the Jesuits who were feared, but the man who commanded them, unseen yet everywhere. The Black Pope was no longer a figure of rumor alone. He had become, in the eyes of his enemies, the hidden emperor of a world within the world. The 16th and 17th centuries were filled with kings who glittered in robes of silk, queens who walked beneath jeweled crowns, and nobles who flaunted their wealth in courts across Europe. Yet behind those dazzling displays of majesty, another kind of figure often lurked in the background, a quiet advisor, a confessor, a teacher whose influence was invisible but profound. Again and again, that figure was a Jesuit. And behind each Jesuit, many suspected, was a steady hand of their superior general, the Black Pope. It was in royal courts that the Jesuit subtle power became most feared. Kings and princes were raised in Jesuit schools, schooled in languages, philosophy, mathematics, and, most importantly, obedience to the Church. When those boys became rulers, their memories of Jesuit tutors and confessors did not vanish. Instead, they carried a quiet loyalty into adulthood, and with it came whispers. Were these kings truly free in their decisions, or were they still guided by the shadows of their Jesuit masters? Consider the court of France. Hey, the Jesuits became confessors to the monarchs themselves. For the devout king, confessing sins was no casual ritual. It was a sacred act, the unburdening of a soul. And yet, that intimate ritual gave the Jesuit confessor access to the most secret fears, desires, and intentions of the ruler. What advice was offered afterward? What counsel was given in the privacy of that chamber? None could know, and so imagination filled the void. Many began to see Jesuits not as May priests, but as hidden hands shaping policy, diplomacy, and war from behind the curtain. In Spain, the same whispers spread. Jesuit confessors guided monarchs on decisions of conscience, war, and empire. Was it coincidence? People asked that Spain remained such a fierce defender of Catholic power even as its empire began to wane? Or did the Jesuits themselves urge policies that served their mission first and the crown second? When rulers leaned too heavily on Jesuit advice, rivals accused them of surrendering their sovereignty to the Black Pope in Rome. But the influence of the Jesuit was not confined to kings and queens. Noble families, seeking prestige, often entrusted their sons to Jesuit tutors. Those young men grew to inherit estates, titles, and seats of political influence. Their decisions, shaped in youth by Jesuit teaching, were felt across parliaments and councils. Slowly, an image formed. The Jesuits were planting their influence not in one throne but in dozens, nurturing vines of loyalty that climbed quietly into every corner of power. Of course, Jesuit defenders would argue that their role was nothing sinister. They claimed they were simply guiding rulers in matters of faith and morality, ensuring that kings governed with conscience. To them, this was not manipulation but service. Yet perception is often stronger than truth, and perception painted them as puppet masters hidden in plain sight. And perception soon hardened into paranoia. Pamphlets circulated across Europe, painting lurid images of Jesuits whispering into the ears of monarchs, steering entire kingdoms like chess pieces. Satirists depicted kings as marionettes, their strings pulled by black-robed priests. In an age where rumors spread like wildfire, the idea of a hidden black pope ruling from the shadows found fertile soil. There were moments when these suspicions seemed to leap from rumor into reality. Take the case of Henry IV of France. Once a Protestant, his conversion to Catholicism brought stability to a fractured kingdom. And yet, Jesuit influence was never far from him. Their presence at his court caused unease among Protestants, who saw in the Jesuits not reconciliation but manipulation. When Henry was later assassinated by a Catholic zealot, enemies of the order wasted no time in suggesting that Jesuit whispers had fanned the flames of fanaticism. Was it true? History offers no proof. But the suspicion alone was enough to deepen the myth of their power. In England, where Protestant rule was fiercely guarded, Jesuit became the bogeyman of political imagination. Rumors tied them to plots against Queen Elizabeth and King James, most infamously the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Though Jesuit involvement was never fully proven, the very mention of their name was enough to strike terror. To English Protestants, the Jesuits were not only the Pope's soldiers, they were agents of the Black Pope, moving unseen across borders, conspiring against monarchs, and seeking to topple governments in service of Rome. But perhaps the most telling sign of their influence was the fear they inspired among their own allies. Even Catholic monarchs who welcomed Jesuit guidance also watched them with suspicion. For the order's obedience to their general was absolute. A king might command the loyalty of his subjects, but could he ever command the loyalty of a Jesuit more than their superior general? The answer, whispered in courtly corridors, was always no, and that meant that in every royal court where a Jesuit stood, the Black Pope's shadow was present as well. The genius of this influence was its invisibility. Jesuits rarely held official titles of state. They did not sit on thrones. They did not lead armies. Instead, they occupied spaces that were intimate, private, and personal, confessionals, classrooms, and council chambers. These spaces were shielded from public view, making it impossible to know exactly how much sway they held. And so, suspicion filled the void. What is hidden often feels more powerful than what is seen. By the 17th century, the myth of Jesuit influence had become a weapon. Rival factions accused one another of being puppets of the order. Political opponents spread rumors of Jesuit plots to assassinate monarchs, poison rivals, or orchestrate coups. Each accusation, whether true or false, added another layer to the legend of the Black Pope. The Jesuits themselves denied such charges, often with indignation. But once the seed of doubt had been planted, denial only seemed like further proof of secrecy. The more one looked, the more it seemed that Jesuit fingers touched everything. If a monarch made a surprising decision, some whispered it must have been inspired by Jesuit counsel. If a war broke out, others claimed it was orchestrated to serve the order's hidden agenda. If peace was achieved, cynics argued it was merely a strategic move by the Black Pope. In this way, the Jesuit became both admired and feared, both saints and villains, depending on the storyteller. This duality, admiration mixed with fear, was a true foundation of the Black Pope's reputation. For his influence was never proven in ledgers or decrees, but felt in the unease of rulers, the paranoia of nobles, and the whispers of the streets. To some, he was a hidden protector of Christendom, guiding kings toward righteousness. To others, he was the unseen tyrant, manipulating crowns from behind velvet curtains. As the 17th century advanced, this shadow reputation only deepened. Every royal court became a stage where the same question echoed. Was a king ruling his people, or was the Black Pope ruling through him? And as suspicion grew sharper, so did the backlash. Monarchs who once relied on Jesuit guidance began to fear their power. Rival clerics in the church, jealous of their reach, whispered warnings to the Vatican itself. The stage was set for conflict not just between nations, but between the Jesuits and the very powers they served. The throne was never empty, but the shadow behind it was often darker and far more enduring. And in those shadows, the legend of the Black Pope was forged, not as a visible ruler, but as the invisible presence that seemed to haunt the very idea of monarchy itself. By the time the Jesuits had woven themselves into the fabric of kingdoms and courts, admiration had already turned to unease. Their brilliance and education, their tireless missionary zeal, and their uncanny ability to influence rulers earned them fame. But fame soon curdled into suspicion. Wherever the Jesuits planted themselves, they seemed to create both allies and enemies in equal measure. And those enemies would become some of the fiercest the Catholic world had ever seen. In France, the whispers grew louder with each passing year. Protestant Huguenots accused the Jesuits of being the Pope's secret army, plotting to undo the fragile peace of the kingdom. Pamphlets circulated, filled with venomous warnings that Jesuits sought not only to shape consciences but to topple monarchs. To their critics, every dagger drawn in religious conflict seemed to gleam with Jesuit fingerprints. The assassination of Henry IV became, for many, the ultimate proof, even if evidence was thin, that the order was more than spiritual guides. They were suspected architects of death. The tension in England was no less fierce. For Protestants, the Jesuits embodied the darkest fears of Rome's influence. Tales of Jesuit spies prowling London, whispering in secret chapels, or plotting rebellion spread like wildfire. The gunpowder plot, though never conclusively tied to the order, was forever stamped with their shadow. The name Jesuit became synonymous with treachery, and the Black Pope loomed in the English imagination as a puppet master of sedition. To accuse a rival of being tied to the Jesuits was to accuse him of being an enemy of the crown itself. But the fiercest hostility did not always come from outside the church. It also came from within. Other religious orders looked upon the Jesuits with envy and suspicion. The Benedictines, Dominicans, and Franciscans had existed for centuries, their traditions rooted in monasteries and ancient rites. The Jesuits, by contrast, seemed new, dynamic, and shockingly modern. They did not bind themselves to cloisters. They did not chant in abbeys. Instead, they strode boldly into universities, courts, and cities. To older orders, this was arrogance, an upstart society acting as though it alone carried the flame of Catholic truth. And then there was the Vatican itself. Popes had once embraced the Jesuits as loyal soldiers of the Church. Yet as decades passed, some pontiff began to see them less as servants and more as rivals. The Black Pope, the general of the Society of Jesus, commanded absolute obedience from thousands of men across the world. His reach extended to missions in Asia, schools in Europe, and courts in South America. In comparison, the Pope in white often looked weakened, besieged by political pressures and limited in power. Whispers began. Was the Black Pope becoming more influential than the Pope himself? Monarchs, too, began to grow wary. The very kings who had once trusted Jesuit confessors now feared their presence at court. For what ruler could ever command greater loyalty than the Jesuits vowed to their general? To have a Jesuit whispering in a king's ear was, some claimed, to have a foreign sovereign intruding into national affairs. The suspicion was sharpest in nations already nervous about foreign influence. In Portugal, Spain, and France, accusations mounted that Jesuit missions abroad were less about saving souls and more about carving out independent states within empires, miniature theocracies loyal only to Rome and the Black Pope. The 17th century became an age of pamphlets and polemics, and in these pages the Jesuits were painted as everything from assassins to sorcerers. Writers accused them of double-dealing, of swaying kings to tyranny, of undermining the liberties of nations. Some even spun elaborate tales of the Jesuits seeking global domination, a shadow empire that rivaled all earthly crowns. It was a mythology as powerful as it was dangerous. For once an enemy is imagined as omnipotent, every disaster can be blamed upon them. To be a Jesuit in this climate was to walk a razor's edge. On one side lay admiration, the gratitude of students, converts, and monarchs who valued their wisdom. On the other side lay hatred, the suspicion of conspiracies, the fear of domination, the envy of rivals. Few figures in history have been so loved and so loathed at once. The very qualities that made the Jesuits effective, discipline, intelligence, loyalty, were recast by their enemies as weapons of subversion. This hostility was not without consequence. Laws were passed to restrict Jesuit activity. In Protestant nations, their very presence was considered treason. In Catholic realms, rulers eyed them warily, suspicious that their loyalty to the Black Pope eclipsed loyalty to Crown. Tensions mounted, and the stage was being set for a clash that would one day shake the very foundations of the order. For in every rumor, in every pamphlet, in every whispered accusation, one figure stood at the center. Not the nameless missionary in a distant jungle, not the humble schoolteacher in a Paris classroom, but the general in Rome, the Black Pope. To friends, he was a spiritual commander of a noble army. To enemies, he was a shadow tyrant of Christendom, a ruler without a throne, plotting in secrecy against nations themselves. The Jesuits had made powerful allies, but they had also forged powerful enemies. And as their empire of influence expanded, those enemies began to conspire not merely to resist them, but to bring them down. The world was preparing to turn against the Society of Jesus. And when it did, the legend of the Black Pope would only grow darker. Clothing has always carried power. Kings wrapped themselves in purple, popes in white, bishops in crimson. Each color, each garment, was more than fabric. It was a symbol, a statement, a declaration of who held authority. And then came the Jesuits in simple black robes. No jewels, no crowns, no silk embroidery. Just stark, unbroken black. Yet it was precisely this austerity that unsettled people. For in a world where rulers shouted their power in color and gold, the Jesuits whispered theirs in shadow. The black cassock was meant to reflect humility. It stripped away luxury, reminding the world that Jesuits were servants of Christ, detached from worldly vanities. But symbols often mean more than what their wearers intend. To allies, the black garb spoke of discipline, seriousness, and unshakable devotion. To enemies, it looked ominous, like the uniform of a secret order. They seemed less like humble priests and more like soldiers of a hidden empire, their loyalty stitched into the very fabric of their clothing. The symbolism deepened when people began to contrast the black robes with the white of the Pope. The Bishop of Rome wore white to embody purity, light, and visibility. His authority was open, radiant, displayed for the world to see. The Jesuit general, however, wore black, the color of mystery, secrecy, and the unseen. Thus the nickname was born, the Black Pope. He was imagined not as a rival pontiff in name, but as a dark reflection of the papacy itself, its hidden twin, its shadow counterpart. It did not help that Jesuits carried themselves with a quiet confidence. They were educated, eloquent, and disciplined, their very demeanor setting them apart from ordinary clergy. When they walked through cities or royal courts, their black cassocks seemed to draw eyes. People whispered as they passed, were these men scholars, confessors, or spies? Were they serving Christ, or serving the designs of their mysterious general in Rome? The human imagination thrives on contrast. The white and the black, the visible and the invisible, the crown and the shadow. The image of two popes, one bathed in light, the other cloaked in darkness, was irresistible. It gave flesh to rumors of hidden control, of a secret papacy pulling the strings behind the throne of St. Peter. The Jesuit general, though rarely seen by the public, became in rumor as famous as the Pope himself. The black robe also carried echoes of death. In an age where mortality was ever present, plague, war, and famine stalking Europe, the color black spoke of graves and finality. Enemies of the Jesuits seized upon this symbolism, portraying them as harbingers of doom. Pamphlets depicted them as crows circling thrones, their black wings spread wide over kingdoms. Their very dress became evidence of sinister intent. After all, who but servants of a hidden, deathly power would shun the bright vestments of the church? And yet, to their followers, the same black meant something entirely different. It spoke of humility, of men who chose to reject vanity. Jesuits argued that the absence of color represented their mission, to disappear into service, to strip away individuality, to belong entirely to Christ and their order. The general in black was not a rival pope, they insisted, but a humble servant, directing his men as a general might direct soldiers, but soldiers of faith, not war. Still, symbolism is not easily controlled. Once the image of the Black Pope had taken root, it grew far beyond intention. Even those who admired the Jesuits often admitted that there was something unsettling about their uniform appearance, their stark clothing, their aura of quiet discipline. They were like a brotherhood of shadows, ever present, never flamboyant, yet impossible to ignore. What terrified rulers most was not the robe itself, but what it seemed to represent: unity. A king might wear gold and purple, but his court was filled with rivals, nobles scheming against him, generals loyal only to themselves. The Jesuits, by contrast, wore the same black robe wherever they went, whether in Rome, Paris, or Beijing. That uniformity symbolized an allegiance stronger than any courtly bond, an obedience that could stretch across continents. It suggested that, no matter how far they traveled, Jesuits remained tethered to their general in Rome. The robe was a visible sign of invisible chains. And in the imagination of Europe, the chains all led back to one man. The black garment became not just a uniform but a banner, a sign that these men belonged to the Black Pope and to him alone. Every Jesuit in black seemed like a walking reminder that somewhere in Rome, behind closed doors, a powerful figure gave orders that spanned the world. By the 17th century, the robe had become inseparable from the myth. To their admirers, the Jesuits were spiritual warriors clothed in humility. To their enemies, they were the dark-armored legion of a secret sovereign. And once a symbol hardens into myth, it is almost impossible to unmake. The more the Jesuits denied the sinister image, the more people believed it. The black robe was simple, perhaps even meant to be invisible. But instead, it became one of the most powerful symbols in Christendom, at once a badge of devotion and a cloak of suspicion. It was not merely cloth. It was an idea, a fear, a legend. And as the legend grew, so too did the shadow of the Black Pope. Power always attracts rumor, and rumor always seeks scandal. For the Jesuits, the most dangerous rumor of all was that of assassination. Again and again, enemies claimed that beneath their black robes, behind their scholarly lectures and pious sermons, the Jesuits concealed daggers. Whenever a king was murdered, whenever a crown was threatened, whispers arose, "The Jesuits are behind it." The accusation was irresistible because it seemed to fit the legend. After all, these were men who confessed kings, who whispered counsel in private chambers, who claimed obedience to a general unknown to most of the world. Was it not plausible, then, that they might use their influence, or even their blades, to eliminate those who opposed them? France became the stage for some of the loudest whispers. The assassination of Henry IV in 1610 shocked Europe. A devout Catholic fanatic struck him down in the streets of Paris, and though no evidence tied the Jesuits to the act, suspicion clung to them like smoke. After all, Jesuits had been his confessors. They had been at his court, and his attempts at tolerance toward Protestants had angered Catholic hardliners. To Henry's enemies, it was easy to claim, who but the Jesuits would benefit from his death? In England, where anti-Catholic paranoia already burned hot, Jesuits were imagined as the invisible hand behind plots and rebellions. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605 cemented this image. Though the extent of Jesuit involvement remains debated, the very mention of their name was enough to brand the order as traitorous. To Protestants, the story was clear. Jesuit priests had guided conspirators to blow up Parliament and kill King James I. Whether true or not, the tale painted Jesuits as assassins lurking in the shadows of politics, waiting for the moment to strike. Even in Spain and Portugal, where Jesuits had long enjoyed royal favor, the same accusations arose. Whenever monarchs fell ill, whenever succession crises brewed, whispers stirred. Perhaps poison had been placed by Jesuit hands. It mattered little that proof was scarce. In the charged atmosphere of 17th century Europe, rumor had the force of fact. And rumors of murder are the most enduring of all. Pamphlets fanned the flames. Writers eager to discredit the order published sensational tracts accusing Jesuits of training assassins, of teaching that killing heretical rulers was justified, even holy. Their enemies seized on passages from obscure Jesuit writings, twisting them into evidence that the order condoned tyrannicide. Soon, the stereotype hardened. The Jesuit was not merely a priest. He was a dagger wrapped in a cassock. The truth was far more complex. Officially, the Society of Jesus condemned violence. Their mission, they insisted, was to educate, to convert, to guide. Yet the perception persisted that Jesuits blurred the line between spiritual and political warfare. For if a Jesuit truly believed the soul of a nation depended on the faith of its ruler, could he not also believe that removing a heretical king was an act of divine necessity? Enemies of the order shouted yes. Jesuits themselves quietly said no. But in the court of public opinion, denials were drowned by fear. The myth of Jesuit assassins took root because it filled a need. Monarchs feared invisible enemies. Rivals of the order sought to discredit them. And ordinary people, anxious about wars of religion, wanted explanation for chaos. When kings died or plots were uncovered, the Jesuits provided a ready-made villain. They were everywhere. They were secretive, and their loyalty to the Black Pope was absolute. What more perfect conspirators could there be? As decades passed, the accusations only grew. In England, the popish plot hysteria of the 1670s painted Jesuits as the masterminds of a vast conspiracy to kill King Charles II and impose Catholic rule. The charges were fabricated, the evidence false, yet Jesuits were hunted and executed on the strength of nothing more than rumor. Innocence mattered little. The myth of the assassin Jesuit had already become part of the cultural imagination. Even within Catholic lands, rulers began to echo these suspicions. Jesuits were accused of meddling too deeply in politics, of steering kings, of deciding who lived and who died. Whenever a monarch defied papal authority, whispers circulated that Jesuit assassins were sharpening their blades. For enemies of the Black Pope, the conclusion was obvious. The Jesuits were not content to advise kings. They chose which kings were allowed to live. This was the heart of the affair. It was not just that Jesuits might kill. It was that they might kill with impunity, hidden behind the authority of confession, cloaked in the secrecy of their order. Who could accuse them? Who could prove anything? If the Jesuits truly served a hidden master in Rome, what limits did they recognize? The irony is that these accusations, though rarely proven, only made the Jesuits more powerful in imagination. A king who believed the whispers would tread carefully in opposing them. A rival order, fearing their rumored daggers, would hesitate to attack them too openly. The Jesuits have become not just men but myths, myths capable of inspiring awe, fear, and obedience. Yet the danger of such myths is that they eventually consume their subjects. By the 18th century, the image of Jesuit assassins had become so entrenched that it fueled the growing movement to suppress the entire order. Monarchs who once valued their counsel began to fear their knives. The Vatican itself, pressured by courts across Europe, started to wonder whether the Black Pope's shadow had grown too dark, too dangerous. The whispers of assassination were never silenced. They followed the Jesuits wherever they went, shaping their reputation long after the supposed plots had faded into history. And each whisper, each rumor, added another layer to the legend of the Black Pope, a figure who seemed to hold life and death itself in his invisible hands. Throughout history, power has always been bound to knowledge. To control information is to shape destiny. The Jesuits understood this more clearly than most. From their earliest days, they established schools, libraries, and printing presses, making themselves the guardians of learning. But with that role came suspicion. To their critics, the Jesuits were not just teachers, they were gatekeepers of secrets. They were accused of hoarding forbidden knowledge, of preserving mysteries too dangerous for ordinary eyes, and of bending wisdom itself to serve their hidden purposes. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was in the midst of an intellectual revolution. New lands were being discovered, old assumptions shattered. Copernicus and Galileo had thrown the heavens into doubt, while explorers brought back stories of civilizations that did not fit neatly into the biblical narrative. The Jesuits stood at the crossroads of this new knowledge. Their missions reached to China, India, Japan, and the Americas. They studied languages, cataloged plants, mapped continents. They translated texts that Europeans had never seen. And yet, they did not always share what they learned. Instead, they stored their findings in private archives, reports circulated only within the order, letters sent back to Rome and locked away from the public. This secrecy bred legends. What were the Jesuits hiding? Some claimed they had proof of ancient civilizations far older than the Bible allowed. Others whispered that they had uncovered hidden sciences in Asia, secrets of astronomy, medicine, or even alchemy that might give them an advantage over other powers. Their presence at the courts of China's emperors especially fascinated Europeans. Rumors spread that Jesuits had learned secrets from the Forbidden City itself, cosmic charts, ancient prophecies, and technologies unknown in the West. Back in Europe, the Jesuits' role in education only deepened the suspicion. They taught mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and theology, but always within carefully controlled boundaries. Students might be exposed to the theories of Copernicus or Galileo, but only after the Jesuits had wrapped them in layers of theological commentary. Was this education or censorship? Enemies accused them of manipulating knowledge, feeding young minds only what served their hidden agenda. The image of the Jesuit school became that of a laboratory where thought itself was shaped and molded to the order's will. The most tantalizing accusations concerned the occult. In an age obsessed with alchemy, astrology, and hidden wisdom, it was inevitable that the Jesuits would be suspected of dabbling in forbidden arts. Their mastery of languages, their coded letters, their secretive rituals of obedience, all looked to outsiders like signs of esoteric initiation. Pamphlets accused them of being magicians disguised as priests, of blending Christianity with the hidden sciences of the East. Some even went so far as to claim the Jesuits had inherited the lost wisdom of the Templars, preserving books and relics that should have perished in the flames. These fears were intensified by the Jesuits' reputation for discipline. Every member of the order was trained to obey without question, to hold his tongue, to keep secrets even under torture. Outsiders imagine what kinds of secrets must require such silence. Did the Black Pope keep in his archives manuscripts too dangerous for the Vatican itself? Were there maps of undiscovered lands, treatises on forbidden sciences, accounts of miracles or curses that could shake the faithful? The less the Jesuits revealed, the more people speculated. And then there was China. Jesuits such as Matteo Ricci astonished Europe with tales of Confucian philosophy, intricate calendars, and an empire whose history stretched back millennia. But Ricci and his successors also held back much of what they knew, sending private reports to Rome that never reached the public. Some scholars later suggested that the Jesuits had access to Chinese astronomical records far older than any in Europe, data that could have transformed Western science. Others whispered that they had seen relics of ancient technologies, devices or mechanisms that hinted at a lost age of human achievement. Whether true or not, the suspicion lingered. The Jesuits had knowledge but chose not to share it. Their secrecy was not limited to science. In theology, too, they were accused of doublespeak. Critics claimed that Jesuits possessed two versions of truth, one for the faithful, another for the initiated. They were charged with teaching casuistry, a form of moral reasoning that, in the eyes of their enemies, allowed them to twist any rule to justify any act. To some, this was not just clever logic but a secret doctrine, an inner teaching that gave Jesuit permission to bend morality itself. Such accusations painted the Jesuits not only as manipulators of kings but as masters of spiritual deception. The myth of forbidden knowledge reached its height in the 18th century, when Enlightenment thinkers turned their suspicion into open hostility. Philosophers accused the Jesuits of deliberately suppressing scientific truth, of hoarding discoveries to maintain their grip on power. Voltaire, never one to spare a venomous word, depicted them as intellectual tyrants who feared nothing more than the free circulation of ideas. And when monarchs across Europe moved to expel the order, they justified their actions in part by claiming that the Jesuits controlled knowledge that belonged to all, not just to their shadowy order. Ironically, the destruction of the Jesuit order in the 1770s only deepened the aura of mystery. Their schools were closed, their libraries seized, their archives sealed. Yet instead of dispelling the rumors, this only fueled them. What lost manuscript had vanished when the Jesuit houses were ransacked? What documents had been spirited away to Rome before officials could confiscate them? Even today, scholars speculate about the vast Monumenta Historica Societatis Jesu, the immense Jesuit archives in Rome, much of which remains unpublished. To conspiracy-minded critics, this is proof enough. The Jesuits still guard secrets that the world is not permitted to know. The power of the legend lies not in what the Jesuits actually possess, but in what others believe they possessed. Knowledge is always half fact, half imagination. The Jesuits, with their global reach, their strict discipline, and their refusal to reveal all they knew, became the perfect vessel for projection. They were accused of knowing everything: the true history of the world, the hidden sciences, the forbidden paths of philosophy, and by withholding it, they seemed to hold the keys to history itself. In truth, perhaps their greatest forbidden knowledge was not a single secret, but a realization that secrecy itself creates power. By keeping some things hidden, By publishing some reports and not others, by cultivating the aura of mystery, the Jesuits ensured that their influence reached far beyond the classroom or the pulpit. They became, in the imagination of Europe, not just priests or teachers, but custodians of the unknown. And in the shadows of that unknown, the figure of the Black Pope loomed ever larger, a man imagined to sit atop vaults of secrets, guardian of truth that could shake kingdoms and challenge heaven itself. By the middle of the 18th century, the Jesuits had become both indispensable and intolerable. They were confessors to kings, advisors to queens, teachers of princes, and missionaries stretching from the Amazon to Beijing. Yet their very success sowed the seeds of their destruction. Monarchs who once relied on their counsel began to resent their influence. Philosophers who once admired their learning now denounced their secrecy. And in Rome, even within the Church, whispers grew louder that the Jesuits had grown too powerful, too independent, too dangerous to the stability of Christendom itself. The first blows came not from Rome but from Lisbon. In 1759, the Portuguese crown, under the iron-willed statesman Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal, moved to expel the Jesuits. The official accusation was that the society had incited rebellion in the colonies of South America, particularly among the Guarani missions. But beneath the surface lay a deeper resentment. The Jesuits' ability to inspire loyalty that rivaled the kings, their wealth in land and trade, and their refusal to bow fully to royal authority. Pombal staged trials, spread lurid pamphlets, and painted the Jesuits as enemies of the state. By the end of the year, their houses were confiscated, their schools shut down, and their priests forced onto ships bound for exile. France followed soon after. There, the Jesuits faced a coordinated campaign from Jansenists, philosophes, and the Parliament of Paris. Voltaire mocked them as the army of the Pope, while Enlightenment thinkers accused them of corrupting youth with blind obedience and manipulating kings with subtle flattery. In 1764, King Louis XV, pressured by his ministers and courts, suppressed the Society of Jesus in France. The Jesuit schools that had once educated the nation's elite were shuttered almost overnight. Spain, too, turned against them. King Charles III, wary of the Jesuits' influence and alarmed by popular unrest, expelled them in 1767. In a single coordinated strike, thousands of Jesuits were rounded up across the Spanish Empire, from Madrid to Mexico City, from Lima to Manila, forced onto ships, and set adrift with nothing but the clothes they wore. The most disciplined order in the Church was suddenly reduced to refugees, wandering Europe in search of shelter. The final blow came in 1773, when Pope Clement XIV, under immense pressure from the Bourbon monarchies of Europe, issued the papal Brief Dominus Ac Redemptor. With a stroke of the pen, the Society of Jesus was officially suppressed. The Jesuit Order, which had shaped empires, counseled kings, and been feared as the soldiers of the Pope, was dissolved. Its members were scattered, some absorbed into local dioceses, others driven underground, still others taking refuge in sympathetic territories such as Prussia or Russia. To the world, it seemed as though the Black Pope had been dethroned, his shadowy influence broken at last. Enlightenment thinkers celebrated what they saw as a triumph of reason over superstition. Kings congratulated themselves on breaking free from Rome's hidden grip, and pamphleteers declared the Jesuits finished forever. But as history would prove, the Jesuits were not so easily erased. For while Clement XIV had officially suppressed the society, Catherine the Great of Russia refused to enforce a decree. She valued the Jesuits' expertise in education too highly to let them go. In her domains, Jesuit schools continued to function, their teacher protected under her personal authority. In Prussia, Frederick the Great also shielded them, pragmatically recognizing their usefulness. From these safe havens, the remnants of the Jesuit order preserved their traditions, their teachings, and their discipline, waiting for the tides of history to shift once more. And shift they did. The suppression had not destroyed the Jesuit spirit. If anything, it deepened their aura of mystery. Who could truly annihilate an order so disciplined, so secretive, so accustomed to survival in hostile lands? Whispers spread that the Jesuits continued to operate in the shadows, directing events behind the scenes, disguised as ordinary priests or hidden within other institutions. In the popular imagination, the Black Pope still walked the corridors of power, invisible but present, patient as ever. The French Revolution further changed the landscape. As monarchies fell and the church itself faced persecution, the old enemies of the Jesuits found themselves weakened. By the early 19th century, Europe longed for stability, and the papacy sought to rebuild its shattered institutions. In 1814, Pope Pius VII formally restored the Society of Jesus with a bull Sollicitudo Omnium Ecclesiarum. The Jesuits were reborn, not as a new order, but as one that had survived annihilation and returned stronger for it. Their comeback was dramatic. Almost immediately, they reclaimed their old role as educators, missionaries, and advisors. But now, their legend had grown. They were no longer merely priests with a special vow of obedience. They were the order that had survived kings, philosophers, and even the Pope himself. To some, this made them appear unstoppable, indestructible, an eternal force within the Church. The myth of the Black Pope deepened in this period. If the Jesuits could return from a grave, what else might they be capable of? Conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed that the Jesuits had orchestrated their own suppression, retreating into the shadows only to return more powerful. Others insisted that the Jesuits had influenced Napoleon, steering the French Revolution itself. Every great upheaval of the age seemed to carry the hidden fingerprint of the order. Yet for the Jesuits themselves, survival had come at a cost. Their old enemies had not vanished. In Protestant lands, suspicion of their influence persisted. In Catholic nations, monarchs remained wary of their return. And in the growing secular movements of the 19th century, the Jesuits were painted as relics of an old, oppressive order. They would have to adapt, to reassert their relevance in a world that had changed dramatically since their founding. Still, their return carried a chilling message to their enemies. The Jesuit could not be destroyed. They could be expelled, suppressed, vilified, and outlawed, but they would always endure. Like the shadow of the Black Pope, their presence lingered long after their supposed death. Their fall had been spectacular, their return even more so. For those who believed in their hidden power, this was proof of something terrifying. If the Jesuits could rise again after such total suppression, did that not mean their influence was stronger than kings, stronger than popes, stronger than nations themselves? Were they not, in some sense, eternal? And if so, what secret force sustained them? The story of the fall and return of the Jesuits is not just one of politics and religion. It is a tale of resilience, of an order that thrived in the shadows and learned to use mystery as power. To the faithful, it was evidence of divine protection. To their enemies, it was proof of a conspiracy too vast to be undone. And to the ordinary observer, it left a haunting question. If the Jesuits could come back from annihilation, what else might they be capable of in the centuries to come? By the early 19th century, the Jesuits had returned from the ashes. Restored by Pope Pius VII in 1814, they were once again an official order of the Catholic Church. But something had changed. Their suppression and miraculous survival had transformed their image. They were no longer seen as merely an order of scholars, missionaries, and confessors. Now they were viewed as something darker, something indestructible, something beyond the ordinary limits of papal authority. Out of this transformation arose the legend of the Black Pope. The term was not official. No papal decree declared it. No constitution defined it. Instead, it was whispered, born from rumor, satire, and suspicion. At its heart was a simple, striking image. In Rome, there were two popes. One wore white, the visible shepherd of Christendom. The other wore black, the hidden general, the man who commanded the Jesuit army with absolute authority. While the white pope blessed the crowds from the balcony of St. Peter's, the black pope was said to work in shadows, shaping policy, guiding kings, and pulling strings invisible to the public eye. Why black? Partly, it was a Jesuit's uniform. Simple black cassocks, unadorned by the bright colors of other clerical robes. But the color carried symbolic weight as well. Black was the color of secrecy, of power concealed, of hidden authority. In the imagination of critics, the superior general of the Jesuits was not just a priest but a kind of dark sovereign, cloaked in the mystique of silence and obedience. The first to hold this title in earnest was often considered to be the superior general at the time of the Restoration, Father Tadeusz Brzezowski. He was a Polish Jesuit, frail in health yet iron-willed in spirit, who guided the order through its rebirth in Russia and then across Europe. His leadership, though quiet, set the tone. The Jesuits were back, and their discipline had not diminished. From this point forward, the image of the Black Pope only grew stronger. The 19th century was fertile soil for such a myth. Europe was a continent in upheaval, revolutions, wars of independence, the decline of monarchies, and the rise of nationalism. In each of these crises, the Jesuits were accused of playing a role. Were they advising rulers to resist liberal movements? Were they infiltrating new governments to undermine them from within? To revolutionaries, the Jesuits were reactionaries, agents of papal absolutism, determined to smother freedom wherever it appeared. The image of a hidden pope orchestrating these moves made the story all the more compelling. In Protestant countries, the legend took on even more sinister tones. For centuries, Protestants had suspected Rome of conspiracy. Now the Jesuits, freshly restored, became the perfect villains. Pamphlets and books portrayed the Black Pope as a true master of the Vatican, a manipulator who even the White Pope could not refuse. Some claimed that the Superior General lived in a palace in Rome grander than the Pope's own, commanding thousands of agents across the globe. The Jesuits, according to these tales, were everywhere, in parliaments, universities, banks, even in the press, always working toward a hidden agenda. One of the most striking depictions came from 19th century anti-Catholic literature in England and America. There, the Black Pope was described not just as a rival to the Pope in white, but as his master. The Pope may wear the crown, some said, but the Black Pope holds the keys. This inversion of power made the idea even more tantalizing. The visible head of the church was a figurehead, while the true authority lay in the shadows. Yet the Jesuits themselves never used the title. To them, it was slander, a caricature born of ignorance and fear. The Superior General was no secret pope, they insisted, but simply the leader of their order, bound in loyalty to the real pope. And yet, there was something undeniably unsettling about their structure. The Jesuits were unlike any other order in the church. Their members swore a special full vow of obedience directly to the pope regarding missions. Their chain of command was rigid, military in style, and their Superior General was elected for life, wielding enormous authority over thousands of men scattered across the globe. It was not hard to see why outsiders imagined him as a general in more than name. The Jesuits' own language did little to dispel the myth. They spoke of obedience per inde cadaver, as if they were corpses, lifeless, moved only by the will of their superior. They compared themselves to soldiers in Christ's army, sworn to march wherever commanded. Such imagery, intended as a reflection of humility and devotion, struck outsiders as chilling. If the Jesuits obeyed so absolutely, then the man they obeyed, the Superior General, must possess terrifying power. By the late 19th century, the Black Pope had become a fixture of conspiracy theories. Some linked him to the Masons, claiming a hidden war between secret societies for control of the world. Others tied him to revolutions, assassinations, and even natural disasters. Whenever chaos erupted, it was easy to imagine the unseen hand of the Jesuits at work. What made the legend especially powerful was its ambiguity. Unlike other conspiracy figures, the Black Pope was real. There was, in fact, a man in Rome called the Superior General of the Jesuits, dressed in black, commanding a vast global order. The leap from fact to fantasy required only imagination. Each time the Jesuits were expelled from a country, critics pointed to proof of their influence. Each time they returned, it was seen as evidence of their indestructibility. The man at their head became the perfect scapegoat, the embodiment of suspicion itself. For Catholics, the legend was more complicated. Many admired the Jesuits as defenders of the faith, missionaries who carried Christianity to the farthest corners of the earth, scholars who taught generations of students. To them, the Black Pope was simply a myth, a distortion of a noble office. Yet even within Catholic circles, there was awe. Jesuit discipline and global reach were unique. To the faithful, this was not sinister but inspiring, a sign of divine providence guiding the Church's most dedicated servants. The contrast between these two images, the villain and the saint, the manipulator and the martyr, gave the Black Pope myth its power. Like a shadow cast by a flickering light, it shifted depending on who looked at it. To revolutionaries, he was the enemy of liberty. To monarchs, he was a dangerous ally or a threat to their crown. To Protestants, he was a hidden tyrant of Rome. To Catholics, he was a symbol of resilience and devotion. And so, by the dawn of the 20th century, the Black Pope was no longer just a nickname. He had become a symbol, A legend, a figure larger than the man who bore the office. Each superior general, no matter his personal character, inherited the myth. Some were fiery and outspoken, others scholarly and withdrawn. But in the imagination of the world, each one was the same, the shadow ruler of the Vatican, cloaked in black, pulling unseen strings. This emergence of the Black Pope myth was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a new chapter. For as the modern world marched toward new wars, revolutions, and ideologies, the Jesuits and their mysterious leader would once again find themselves at the heart of history's storms, always accused, never forgotten, forever linked to the specter of hidden power. Few elements of the Jesuit legend have stirred more fear, fascination, and controversy than the so-called Jesuit oath. For centuries, pamphlets and polemics have circulated lurid versions of an alleged oath taken by members of the Society of Jesus, an oath dripping with bloodthirsty vows, terrifying curses, and promises of absolute obedience. According to these documents, Jesuits swore to infiltrate governments, to assassinate kings, to poison chalices, and to strike down enemies of the papacy by any means necessary. It was a text made to terrify, and it did. But was it real? Or was it a weapon of propaganda, forged in the fires of fear? The origins of this oath are murky. The earliest versions appeared not in official Jesuit documents, but in anti-Jesuit pamphlets from the 17th century. These tracts, often produced by Protestant opponents of Rome, presented the Jesuits as a secret army of assassins. The alleged oath confirmed every nightmare, that the society was not a religious order at all, but a global conspiracy sworn to obedience not only in matters of faith, but in the dark art of politics and espionage. By the 18th century, the Jesuit oath was being reprinted across Europe, often accompanied by sensational illustrations of daggers, skulls, and crucifixes. To the enemies of the order, the oath was a smoking gun. Hey, in plain words, was proof that the Jesuits were not priests but killers. The text described hideous rituals, swearing to rip apart heretics and to infiltrate Protestant churches in disguise. It was theatrical, cinematic, written not in the careful tone of ecclesiastical Latin, but in the fiery rhetoric of propaganda. The oath described kneeling before a superior general, kissing a dagger, and swearing loyalty unto death. It promised secrecy so absolute that betrayal would mean a gruesome curse upon one's soul. To readers, it was both horrifying and intoxicating, the kind of secret one almost wished were true simply because it was so dramatic. The Jesuits themselves, of course, denied the oath ever existed. Their actual vows were far simpler: poverty, chastity, obedience, and, for those who reached the highest ranks, a special full vow of obedience to the Pope regarding missions. Nothing about daggers or assassination, nothing about infiltrating governments under false pretenses. The Jesuits pointed to their constitutions, carefully preserved and open for inspection, as evidence that the so-called bloody oath was a fabrication. And yet, once a rumor takes root, it grows in unexpected ways. The oath spread beyond Protestant lands into Catholic ones. Even some monarchs who feared Jesuit influence whispered that the order's loyalty to Rome might be enforced by more than just words of piety. The notion of a hidden vow became powerful, that behind a public facade of discipline and prayer, every Jesuit carried a darker commitment. In the imagination of their enemies, the Jesuits' black cassock concealed not just devotion but daggers. By the 19th century, the alleged oath had taken on a life of its own. It appeared in political speeches, in court cases, even in parliamentary debates. In the United States, where suspicion of Catholics ran high, the Jesuit oath was inserted into congressional records in the 1800s. Anti-Catholic groups brandished it as proof that the Jesuits intended to overthrow American democracy. Nativist movements, already fearful of Irish and Italian Catholic immigrants, found in the oath a rallying cry. If Catholics owed loyalty to a foreign pope, and if Jesuits swore such a dreadful oath, then how could they be trusted in a republic built on liberty? The irony is that this very text, born as propaganda, gained the weight of authenticity simply by repetition. Every reprinting, every fiery sermon, every political speech gave it more credibility. People who had never seen a Jesuit believed they knew what one had sworn to do. And the more the Jesuits denied it, the more their critics said, "See? That's exactly what they would say." What made the oath so effective was that it seemed to explain the Jesuits' extraordinary resilience. How could an order survive suppression, exile, and constant attack? How could they remain so disciplined, so united, so capable of infiltrating the highest levels of power? The answer, for conspiracy-minded critics, was simple. They had sworn an oath so terrifying, so absolute, that betrayal was impossible. They were bound not by faith alone but by fear, not by vows of holiness but by oaths of blood. And yet, when examined closely, the alleged oath reveals itself as a literary construction rather than a ritual. Its language bears the marks of polemic rather than liturgy. It borrows imagery from Gothic novels and courtroom rhetoric, not the sober phrasing of canon law. The gruesome curses it contains echo the style of medieval anti-Catholic propaganda, in which monks and priests were portrayed as sinister caricatures rather than real people. Historians who have traced its origins almost universally agree. The bloody Jesuit oath was a forgery. But here lies a twist. Even if false, the oath became true in its consequences. It shaped public perception. It fueled laws against the Jesuits. It justified expulsions, persecutions, and suspicion. In a sense, the words of the oath mattered less than the belief in the oath. As with all powerful myths, its truth lay not in fact but in faith. Faith and fear. The legend of the Jesuit oath also intersected with the rise of other secret society conspiracies in the 19th century. As Freemasons and Illuminati filled the imaginations of Europe, the Jesuits seemed to belong in the same shadowy world. The oath became the Jesuit equivalent of Masonic initiation, a hidden ritual that bound men to a brotherhood stronger than any law. The difference was that while Masons were accused of seeking liberty against the Church, the Jesuits were accused of seeking tyranny in its name. Two sides of the same secret coin, both feared by the public. Even today, the alleged oath continues to surface. It appears on conspiracy websites, in extremist tracts, and in whispered claims about Vatican intrigue. Modern versions have been embellished with new details, updated for contemporary fears. Some link it to world government, others to financial conspiracies, still others to apocalyptic prophecies. The ghost of the oath, though long exposed as false, refuses to die. Why? Because it taps into something deeper, the fear of hidden power. The Jesuits' real vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, seem almost too ordinary for such an extraordinary order. The myth of the bloody oath fills that gap. It provides a story of secret initiation, of hidden violence, of loyalty enforced by terror. It makes the Jesuits larger than life, more than human, bound by a pact darker than the Church would ever admit. In this sense, whether fact or fiction, the Jesuit oath achieved its purpose. It made the Jesuits unforgettable. It etched the image of the Black Pope's army into the imagination of the world, not as gentle teachers or humble missionaries, but as soldiers of shadows sworn to a cause beyond comprehension. And in doing so, it left us with a haunting question. Which is more powerful in shaping history, the truth of what men actually vow, or the fear of what others believe they have vowed? From the very beginning, the Society of Jesus thought in terms of horizons far beyond Europe. While other religious orders often concentrated their energies within Christendom, the Jesuits imagined the entire globe as their field of action. To be a Jesuit was to be ready to leave one's homeland, perhaps forever, and to set sail toward distant lands where no European had ever preached before. The very structure of the order, with its vow of obedience to the Pope regarding missions, prepared them for a life in motion, a life without borders. And this mobility transformed the Jesuits into one of the first truly global networks in human history. The reach of the Jesuits can be traced on maps that look more like the routes of explorers than the territories of monks. In the 16th century, just decades after their founding, Jesuits had already set foot in India, Japan, Brazil, and Ethiopia. Unlike most religious orders, which grew gradually and locally, the Jesuits leapt across oceans as if distance were no barrier. They embraced the age of discovery not only as a geopolitical revolution, but as a spiritual opportunity, the chance to bring Christianity to the very edges of the earth. One of the earliest and most famous figures was Francis Xavier, who traveled farther than almost any missionary of his time. Beginning in Goa, he journeyed to the Maluku Islands, to Japan, and dreamed of entering China itself. His letters describe encounters with languages, customs, and philosophies utterly foreign to Europe. He marveled at Japanese intellectual life, admired their discipline, and sought ways to express Christianity in terms that resonated with their traditions. Though Xavier died before he could reach the Chinese mainland, his ambition symbolized the Jesuit spirit, restless, daring, unwilling to accept any frontier as final. In the Americas, Jesuits soon carved out missions that would become legendary. In Paraguay, they created the so-called reductions, settlements where indigenous peoples lived under Jesuit guidance, shielded from the brutal exploitation of colonial settlers. These communities were both praised and condemned. Praised for their protection of native rights, condemned for functioning as semi-independent states within empires. To some Europeans, the reductions seemed like utopian experiments, where Christianity and indigenous culture blended in harmony. To others, they looked like a dangerous example of Jesuits acting as rulers in their own right, beyond the authority of crowns and governors. In China, Jesuit missionaries adopted a radically different strategy. Instead of trying to convert through brute preaching, they sought entry into the highest intellectual circles. Matteo Ricci, one of the most brilliant Jesuits, dressed as a Confucian scholar, mastered classical Chinese, and presented Western knowledge of astronomy and mathematics as a gift to the imperial court. He and his successors translated Western works into Chinese and Chinese classics into Latin, opening a two-way dialogue unprecedented in history. For a time, Jesuits held positions as court astronomers and advisors, standing at the crossroads of science and spirituality, East and West. Their methods often sparked controversy within the Church. In China, Jesuits allowed converts to continue certain Confucian rituals, arguing these were cultural rather than religious practices. This accommodation strategy, however, angered other Catholic orders, who accused the Jesuits of compromising the purity of faith. The so-called Chinese rites controversy raged for decades, eventually leading Rome to ban the very practices the Jesuits had tolerated. In this clash, one sees a tension between the Jesuit vision of adaptation, Christianity expressed in local forms, and the Central Church's insistence on uniformity. In Japan, the Jesuit story turned from hope to tragedy. For a time, their mission flourished, attracting converts among both commoners and samurai. But political tides shifted. Suspicion of foreign influence grew, and Christianity came to be seen as a threat to Japanese unity. Persecutions followed, leading to martyrdoms of both Japanese converts and European missionaries. The Jesuit dream of Japan as a new Christian land ended in blood, yet the memory of their presence endured in hidden communities of believers who maintained their faith in secret for centuries. Africa, too, felt the Jesuit touch, though in more fragmented ways. Missions were established in Ethiopia, Angola, and the Congo Kingdom. Jesuits often found themselves navigating the complexities of colonial powers, local rulers, and the brutal realities of the slave trade. Some sought to advocate for the dignity of Africans, while others became entangled in the compromises of empire. In every case, however, their presence testified to an ambition few could rival, to be everywhere, at once, for the sake of the faith. This global spread was not merely geographical, it was intellectual. Jesuits became conduits of knowledge between civilizations. They brought European science, mathematics, and cartography to Asia, while bringing back to Europe new insights into medicine, philosophy, and linguistics. Jesuit reports from abroad, often circulated in Europe as travel literature, shaped the Western imagination of distant lands. Readers who had never seen China or Brazil learned about them through Jesuit pens. In this way, the order not only carried religion outward but also carried knowledge inward, expanding Europe's sense of the world. The global network of Jesuits functioned like the arteries of an organism. Letters, reports, and instructions flowed back and forth between Rome and the farthest corners of the earth. A missionary in Peru could be informed of strategies used in India. A Jesuit in China could send astronomical data to colleagues in Paris. This exchange created what some historians call the first global information system, a web of communication that predated the telegraph and the internet by centuries. Of course, such reach provoked suspicion. Monarchs feared that Jesuits, with their loyalty to the Pope and their global ties, might be serving a power higher than the state. Their missions abroad were admired for courage, but also criticized as tools of papal influence. Were Jesuits spreading the gospel, or were they spreading the papacy's shadow empire? The ambiguity was never fully resolved, and it added to the aura of mystery that always surrounded them. The impact of Jesuit missions outlived their immediate successes and failures. Even when expelled from countries, their schools, translations, and cultural bridges left deep marks. In South America, indigenous communities still recall reductions with mixed memory as havens of protection and as places of control. In China, the scientific works of Jesuits laid foundations that influenced astronomy for centuries. In Japan, the hidden Christians, who preserved their faith underground, stood as living proof of seeds planted by Jesuit hands. To speak of Jesuit global reach is to recognize how the order anticipated modern globalization. They were not merely missionaries. They were travelers, translators, diplomats, scientists, and cultural mediators. They operated in a space that blurred boundaries between faith and politics, between Europe and the wider world. Their story is one of both connection and conflict, of bridges built and bridges burned. In the end, the Jesuits became symbols of a paradox, an order bound by vows of obedience, yet spread across every continent. Men who renounced personal possessions, yet wielded influence in royal courts. Preachers of the gospel, yet suspected as agents of power. Their global reach was not only physical but symbolic. It made them appear both indispensable and dangerous, admired and feared. What other order could claim such universality? None. And this is why the Jesuits, more than any other Catholic group, became the embodiment of a world that was suddenly larger than anyone had imagined. Their black cassocks moved through deserts, jungles, mountains, and palaces alike. They seemed omnipresent, like shadows at the edges of empire. And in that omnipresence lay the source of their legend. For wherever the world expanded, the Jesuits were already there, waiting. By the 18th century, the Jesuits had become both indispensable and intolerable. Their influence reached into royal courts, their schools shaped the elite of Europe, and their missions extended across continents. Yet their very success bred suspicion. Monarchs feared them as agents of the papacy, rival religious orders envied their privileges, intellectuals of the Enlightenment condemned them as reactionary conspirators. Bit by bit, the tide of opinion turned against them, until the unthinkable happened, the suppression of the Society of Jesus itself. The roots of the conflict lay in politics as much as religion. Across Europe, monarchs were centralizing power, determined to break any institution that seemed to challenge their authority. The Jesuits, with their global network and special obedience to the Pope, looked like a foreign body inside national states. In France, tensions flared during the reign of Louis XV, when Jesuit confessors were accused of meddling in affairs of state. In Portugal, the powerful Marquis of Pombal launched a relentless campaign against them, accusing Jesuits of running a state within a state in Brazil and Paraguay. In Spain, Charles III would later follow a similar path, seeing Jesuits as obstacles to reform and royal sovereignty. The Paraguay reductions became a focal point of suspicion. These settlements, where Jesuits organized indigenous communities under their own laws and customs, were admired by some as humanitarian alternatives to colonial exploitation. But to European monarchs, they looked dangerously like independent polities loyal not to crowns but to Jesuit superiors. Rumors spread that the Jesuits commanded their own armies, minted coins, and dreamed of creating a Jesuit kingdom in the Americas. Whether true or exaggerated, such images fueled royal fears and Enlightenment critiques alike. The Enlightenment philosophers added intellectual weight to the campaign. Figures such as Voltaire and Diderot, while often critical of organized religion in general, reserved particular scorn for the Jesuits. To them, the order represented the worst of clerical ambition, secrecy, manipulation, and intolerance disguised beneath scholarship. Jesuit education, once praised for discipline and brilliance, was rebranded as indoctrination. The very qualities that had made the order admired in the 16th century, its unity, adaptability, and reach, were now reinterpreted as sinister tools of control. By the 1750s, expulsions had begun. Portugal acted first, banishing Jesuits from its colonies and from Europe in 1759. France followed in 1764, seizing Jesuit property and dismantling their schools. Spain joined in 1767, deporting thousands of Jesuits in a single coordinated action, sending them into exile in the Papal States. Each expulsion was carried out with military precision, as if removing an enemy army rather than a religious community. The shock was immense. One of the most powerful and respected Catholic orders was being driven from nation after nation. Finally, the pressure reached Rome itself. Pope Clement XIV, caught between loyalty to the order and the demands of Catholic monarchs, issued the brief Dominus Ac Redemptor in 1773, officially suppressing the Society of Jesus worldwide. The papal decree spoke of ending disputes and restoring peace to the Church, but everyone knew the reality. The Jesuits had been sacrificed to placate Europe's rulers. For the first time in its history, the Society of Jesus ceased to exist, at least officially. The suppression sent shockwaves across the Catholic world. Jesuit colleges were closed or handed over to other orders. Missionaries abroad found themselves suddenly without institutional support. Thousands of Jesuits were scattered, forced into secular life, stripped of their communities and vocations. For an order that prided itself on obedience and identity, the loss was devastating. It seemed as if centuries of work had been erased in a single papal stroke. And yet, paradoxically, the suppression did not end the Jesuits, it transformed them. Some regions refused to obey the papal brief fully. In Russia, for example, Catherine the Great valued Jesuit educators too much to let them disappear. She allowed the society to continue operating within her empire, turning it into a strange refuge where Jesuits survived in secret while banned elsewhere. In Prussia, similar toleration allowed remnants of the order to endure. These enclaves became lifelines to the suppressed order, keeping alive its traditions and training new generations quietly while the rest of Europe declared it dead. The scattered Jesuits adapted in creative ways. Some integrated into diocesan clergy, continuing to teach or preach in disguise. Others entered different religious communities while still maintaining their Jesuit spirit. Letters continued to pass between exiled members, preserving a sense of hidden brotherhood. The very skills that had once made them effective missionaries, resilience, adaptability, discretion, now served them in survival. They became, in effect, a secret order within the Church, surviving not through open institutions but through loyalty and memory. For many Catholics, the suppression seemed unjust, a political maneuver disguised as ecclesiastical discipline. Stories spread of Jesuits who faced exile with dignity, who continued teaching children in private, who died clinging to their vows even when forbidden to live them. Such narratives kept alive a romantic vision of the order as victims of persecution, martyrs to their loyalty. Ironically, the suppression only deepened the aura of mystery and power that had always clung to the society. If kings and philosophers had feared them enough to demand their destruction, then surely the Jesuits must have held secrets worth fearing. The survival of the Jesuits through suppression also became a lesson in endurance. Unlike other suppressed groups in history, they managed to outlast their enemies without open rebellion. They did not vanish but waited, quietly, for the world to change. And change it did. By the early 19th century, the tides had turned. The papacy, weakened by the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, sought allies capable of rebuilding Catholic influence. The Jesuits, with their proven loyalty and skill, seemed once again useful. In 1814, Pope Pius VII formally restored the Society of Jesus, declaring it reborn after 4 decades of official death. This restoration was not simply a return to old ways. The suppressed Jesuits had been tested by exile, scattered across continents, forced to adapt in silence. When they re-emerged, they carried with them a hardened sense of mission and identity. They had proven that no decree, no king, not even a pope, could truly erase them. Their global network revived, their schools reopened, and their reputation as a mysterious, indestructible order only grew stronger. The suppression and survival of the Jesuits revealed something essential about their nature. Their strength lay not only in institutions but in the bond between members, in the conviction that their order was more than an organization. It was a vocation sealed by God. To outsiders, this resilience looked uncanny, even dangerous. How could an order declared dead by the Pope himself reappear as if nothing had happened? To insiders, it was a sign of divine providence, proof that the Society's mission was indeed meant to endure against all odds. Thus, the story of suppression became one more chapter in the Jesuit legend. They were not just missionaries, not just scholars, but survivors of annihilation. Their very existence seemed to defy kings, philosophers, and even papal decrees. And in this paradox, the destroyed order that refused to die, the myth of the Jesuits as a church's shadow warriors deepened, preparing the stage for their renewed influence in the modern age. When the Jesuits were restored in 1814, they re-emerged not into a world of simple admiration but into a storm of suspicion. For decades, even centuries, critics had painted them as schemers and manipulators, an invisible hand tugging at the strings of power. This dark reputation became known as the Black Legend of the Jesuits, a web of myths, half-truths, and outright fabrications that cast the society as the secret rulers of Christendom. The roots of the legend stretch back to their earliest days. Their secrecy, their discipline, and their closeness to papal authority made them a target. To Protestants, they embodied everything threatening about Catholicism: hierarchy, obedience, infiltration. To rival Catholics, they seemed arrogant, too independent, too ambitious. And to monarchs, they looked like a foreign army loyal not to crown or country, but to Rome. In every sphere of society, the Jesuit appeared to be other, operating by rules hidden from public view. One of the most damaging aspects of the Black Legend was a charge of political manipulation. Jesuits were accused of being kingmakers and assassins, puppeteers of conscience through their role as confessors. Because Jesuit priests often advised rulers, opponents claimed they whispered policy from behind the confessional screen, controlling states through whispered absolutions. When monarchs died suddenly or wars turned against Catholic nations, conspiracy theories followed. Surely the Jesuits had poisoned, persuaded, or plotted. In Protestant lands, the stories grew more sinister. Pamphlets circulated in England, Germany, and the Netherlands described Jesuits as infiltrators who would stop at nothing to subvert governments. Tales of Jesuits in disguise, posing as merchants, scholars, even Protestants themselves, spread like wildfire. Every act of Catholic resistance, every rebellion, was blamed on Jesuit intrigue. Their very ability to adapt to cultures abroad, so admired in missionary circles, was reimagined as evidence of duplicity. Men without true identity, capable of blending into any society while secretly serving Rome. Perhaps the most infamous accusations came in the form of writings that claimed to expose Jesuit morality. Manuals of casuistry, where Jesuits analyzed complex ethical questions, were twisted into caricatures. Critics claimed Jesuits taught that the ends justify the means, that lying, theft, even murder could be permitted if it served the church. In reality, Jesuit moral theology was nuanced and often cautious, but enemies seized on fragments and exaggerated them until the order was branded as morally corrupt. To this day, the phrase Jesuitical can mean crafty or dishonest, a linguistic scar left by the Black Legend. The myth of Jesuit assassins proved especially persistent. Some claimed Jesuits trained killers to remove heretical rulers. The deaths of Henry III and Henry IV of France, both victims of Catholic zealots, were pinned on the Jesuits, even when no evidence linked the order to the assassins. In England, the gunpowder plot of 1605, a conspiracy to blow up Parliament, was likewise blamed on Jesuits, though historians still debate how involved, if at all, they were. In the public imagination, the Jesuit became synonymous with a shadowy plotter, dagger hidden beneath his robe. Enlightenment thinkers sharpened the legend further. Voltaire mocked them as masters of deceit. Diderot saw them as enslavers of minds. The idea of the Jesuit as a spider at the center of Europe's web of politics suited the rationalist mood. Here was a ready-made villain to explain corruption and tyranny. The suppression of the Jesuits in the 18th century seemed to prove the case. If so many monarchs united to crush them, surely it meant the order had been guilty of monstrous crimes. Rarely did critics pause to ask whether the suppression had been political opportunism rather than a verdict on morality. With their restoration, the legend did not fade but flared anew. In the 19th century, conspiracy theorists linked Jesuits to revolutions and counter-revolutions alike. Some claimed they controlled Freemasonry, others that they fought Freemasonry. In America, Protestant nativists warned that Jesuits planned to subjugate the Republic to papal rule. The fear of papal plots became almost interchangeable with fear of Jesuits, whose reputation for discipline made them seem like shock troops of the Vatican. Even in popular novels and plays, Jesuits appeared as villains, cunning priests with hidden knives, orchestrating events from the shadows. This Black Legend thrived because it drew on kernels of truth. The Jesuits were indeed influential confessors, brilliant educators, tireless missionaries. They did adapt to cultures in striking ways, sometimes compromising with local traditions. They were loyal to Rome above all. But the leap from truth to caricature was vast. What in reality were tools of ministry became, in legend, weapons of control. Their silence was recast as secrecy, their obedience as servitude, their intellectual rigor as manipulation. At the same time, the Black Legend says as much about their enemies as about themselves. Monarchs who expelled them justified their actions by painting them as conspirators. Rival religious orders strengthened their own standing by undermining the Jesuits' reputation. Enlightenment thinkers who opposed Catholic power used Jesuits as a symbol of everything they despised. In this sense, the Jesuit became less a historical actor than a screen onto which others projected their fears. And yet, the legend endured because the Jesuits themselves did little to dispel it. Their discipline forbade them from defending themselves too loudly. Their very secrecy, meant as humility, fed suspicion. To deny every accusation would have been futile. To answer none left the field open to enemies. The result was a paradox. By their silence, they deepened their mystery. By their mystery, they invited darker imagination. Even today, the black legend lingers. In popular culture, Jesuits often appear as scheming figures, guardians of hidden Vatican secrets, or manipulators behind global events. From novels like the Da Vinci Code to countless conspiracy websites, the trope of the Black Pope, the Jesuit Superior General, endures as a shadow ruler of the Church. It is no coincidence that the idea of a Jesuit world order resurfaces whenever anxieties about Catholicism, globalization, or secrecy rise. The Black Legend, then, is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a mirror of how power, secrecy, and influence create myths. The Jesuits may not have been guilty of the wildest accusations, but they were guilty of being different, too disciplined, too global, too loyal to a higher authority. In a world of jealous kings and suspicious rivals, difference was enough to mark them as villains. And so the Jesuits lived on in two parallel realities: the real society of Jesus, flesh and blood men struggling to teach, preach, and serve, and the imagined society, a shadow army lurking in corridors of power. Between those two images lies a tension that gives the Jesuit story its haunting allure. The Black Legend may not be true in fact, but it is true in imagination, and sometimes imagination is more powerful than history itself. Among the many threads of the Jesuit Black Legend, one figure rose to special prominence: the so-called Black Pope. The title referred to the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, the man elected to lead the order for life. Dressed in a simple black cassock rather than the white robes of the pontiff, he commanded obedience from thousands of men scattered across the globe. To admirers, this was a symbol of unity and strength. To critics, it was evidence of a parallel papacy, a shadow ruler hidden behind the throne of St. Peter. The origins of the nickname are murky. Some say it emerged in 17th century Rome, where the Jesuit general's influence was impossible to ignore. Others believe it came later, during suppression debates, when enemies wanted to emphasize the idea that Jesuits obeyed a dark pope instead of the true one. Whatever the case, by the 18th century the term Black Pope was common currency among those who saw the Jesuits as dangerous. The contrast was stark: the white pope, visible, spiritual, and holy; the Black Pope, invisible, political, and cunning. In reality, the Superior General wielded enormous authority. The Jesuit constitutions granted him near-absolute power within the order. He appointed provincials, assigned missions, oversaw finances, and approved or dismissed projects. His command reached from European colleges to Paraguayan reductions, from Chinese courts to African missions. Letters flowed into Rome from across the world, and instructions flowed outward, all under his signature. If the Pope ruled the Church, the Jesuit general ruled a vast order that often acted like a state within a state. Yet, unlike kings or popes, the Superior General rarely appeared in public. He was not crowned or enthroned. He gave no blessings to crowds in St. Peter's Square. His authority was exercised quietly within the walls of Jesuit headquarters near the Jesuit Church in Rome. This invisibility only heightened the aura of mystery. While the Pope's every gesture was scrutinized, the general moved in shadows, known mostly through whispers and rumors. The secrecy of Jesuit governance gave critics fertile ground. Because members swore a special vow of obedience to the Pope regarding missions, outsiders assumed they would obey their general with even greater zeal. Caricatures described him as a tyrant, ruling with iron discipline, directing spies and assassins. The nickname Black Pope became shorthand for this imagined despotism, a dark mirror of the papacy itself. The idea of two popes, one white, one black, resonated with an almost mythic power. It seemed to confirm suspicions that the Church was divided, that behind the open rituals of Rome a second authority lurked, secret and unchecked. For conspiracy theorists, the symbolism was irresistible: the light of Peter's successor versus the shadow of Loyola's heir. Even in modern times, Anti-Catholic tracts recycle this imagery, depicting the superior general as a hidden master of the Vatican, the true power behind the throne. Some of the whispers were not entirely without cause. Jesuit generals did exercise remarkable independence. They maintained their own networks of communication, often receiving information faster than the papacy itself. They controlled considerable wealth through Jesuit schools, estates, and missions, and their men were embedded in courts, universities, and missions across continents. To monarchs who struggled to keep even their own nobles loyal, the idea of one man commanding such global obedience seemed not only strange but threatening. During the Suppression era, the figure of the Black Pope loomed larger than ever. Enemies insisted that the general had manipulated kings, schemed to carve out a Jesuit empire, and even plotted to kill monarchs who opposed him. In pamphlets and plays, he appeared as the archetype of clerical ambition, a spider at the center of a global web. That many Jesuits were in exile, penniless and disbanded, mattered little. The image of their general as a hidden ruler endured. After the order's restoration in 1814, the legend was revived once more. As Jesuits rebuilt their schools and resumed missionary work, critics resurrected the old language of the Black Pope. Now, in the age of revolutions and democracy, the idea of a secret general controlling thousands of educated men seemed even more suspicious. Protestants in America warned of Jesuit infiltration of schools and politics, claiming the Black Pope directed them to subvert the Republic. In Europe, where political tensions ran high, the general became an easy scapegoat for Catholic ultramontanism, the belief in strong papal power. But beneath the exaggerations, the role of the superior general remained more spiritual than political. His task was to keep the order united, to guide its mission, to ensure fidelity to its founding spirit. Jesuit generals did not command armies or plot coups. They oversaw colleges, missions, and retreats. Yet the structure of obedience gave the office an aura unlike any other in the Church. To the outside world, that discipline could look like fanaticism. To insiders, it was simply the price of a common calling. The mystery deepened because so little was known about the men themselves. Unlike popes, whose lives were documented and scrutinized, many Jesuit generals lived and died in quiet obscurity, remembered mainly by their brethren. Their anonymity allowed critics to project whatever image they wished. If a pope was too human to embody pure fear, the Black Pope was abstract enough to become a myth, a faceless, nameless power, eternal and unchanging. Even in modern times, the whispers persist. Websites devoted to Vatican conspiracies insist that the superior general is a true head of the Church, with popes as mere figureheads. Some connect the Black Pope to global banking systems, intelligence agencies, or shadow governments. In this fevered imagination, every political upheaval has Jesuit fingerprints, and every papal decision is scripted by the general's pen. The fact that modern Jesuit generals live relatively quiet lives does nothing to dispel the myth. Secrecy, after all, feeds suspicion. The truth, as always, is less dramatic but no less fascinating. The title Black Pope reveals how power is often perceived through symbols rather than facts. The black cassock, the lifelong term of office, the global network of men bound by obedience, all these combine to create the impression of a hidden pope. Whether or not the general ever wielded such authority, the imagination of his enemies made it so. And in this lies the enduring paradox of the Jesuits. Their very strength, discipline, unity, loyalty, created the image of tyranny. Their humility and silence became the mask of conspiracy. Their global presence made them appear omnipresent. The Black Pope was less a man than a symbol of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the hidden, fear of a church with two heads. Thus, the whispers of the Black Pope echo through history not because they are true, but because they satisfy a deep human need for explanation. Where there is mystery, people create legends. And in the Jesuit general, the world found a perfect canvas for its darkest suspicions. Hidden deep within the walls of the Vatican lies a place that has fascinated historians, conspiracy theorists, and storytellers alike. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, once ominously called the Secret Archives. For centuries, this collection of documents has been cloaked in mystery, giving rise to rumors of forbidden knowledge, lost gospels, and Jesuit conspiracies. While in reality the word secret once simply meant private, the aura of the forbidden has never faded. And for those who weave tales of Jesuit influence, the archives have always appeared as a perfect vault of secrets, a silent treasury of truths too dangerous for the world to know. The image of a labyrinthine underground library, stretching for miles beneath Rome, has captured imaginations. Some envision endless corridors lined with locked cabinets, watched over by stern clerics who guard their contents with jealous vigilance. Others picture a vast catacomb where forbidden texts lie buried, sealed away for fear of the chaos they might unleash. At the center of these myths sits the Jesuit Order, often portrayed as both the keepers and manipulators of these hidden writings, the ones who alone can access and interpret what lies within. The origins of this fascination go back to the Renaissance, when popes began gathering state papers, papal bulls, and letters from across Christendom. Over centuries, the collection grew into a vast record of church history, diplomatic correspondence, council decrees, missionary reports, and personal letters of saints and sinners alike. When the Jesuits rose to prominence in the 16th century, many of their most important reports from faraway lands were deposited here. Letters from China, accounts of martyrdom in Japan, dispatches from Paraguay and New Spain. To outsiders, these exotic documents seem to confirm the idea that Jesuits held a secret knowledge of the wider world. But it was not only missionary letters that fueled suspicion. Whispers grew of more dangerous texts, gospels suppressed by the church, records of heresies never revealed, and even prophecies locked away until the appointed time. By the 17th century, writers hostile to Rome began to speak of the archives as a hidden chamber of heretical or magical works. The Jesuits, with their reputation for scholarship and secrecy, were often cast as the archivists of these forbidden tomes. If ancient scrolls hinted at knowledge that could shake the foundations of Christianity, it was assumed that the Jesuits would be the ones to study and conceal them. The Black Legend only magnified these suspicions. Enemies of the order painted vivid pictures of Jesuit generals poring over ancient manuscripts in candlelit vaults, uncovering lost secrets of power and bending them to their will. Pamphlets accused the Jesuits of hiding evidence of their plots within the archives, treaties with monarchs, instructions for assassins, even coded plans for world domination. Of course, little evidence existed for such claims, but secrecy itself was enough. The more inaccessible the archives remained, the more people believed that something world-shattering must be hidden within. In truth, the Vatican archives did contain materials that were politically explosive. Letters revealing papal negotiations with kings, documents about inquisitorial trials, records of internal disputes, all could embarrass powerful figures if revealed. It is no wonder that the archives were jealously guarded. But for the public, that very jealousy was interpreted as proof of far darker contents. If Rome locked its doors so tightly, surely the Jesuits were ones holding the keys. When the order was suppressed in the 18th century, rumors spread that the Jesuit records had been seized and hidden within the Vatican's forbidden halls. Exiles claimed that their letters, memoirs, and even evidence of royal corruption were buried in secret cabinets. For critics, this seemed to confirm everything. The Jesuits had indeed been collecting a hidden record of their machinations, now safely tucked away where no king or scholar could touch it. The vaults became not merely a storehouse of history, but a prison for dangerous truths. The 19th century, with its taste for Gothic romance and secret societies, breathed new life into the legend. Writers conjured images of Jesuits descending by torchlight into subterranean vaults, consulting scrolls of alchemy, astrology, and forbidden theology. Popular novels imagined hidden libraries where Jesuits kept records of occult experiments, magical formulas, and apocalyptic prophecies. The very idea of the archive became inseparable from the myth of Jesuit secrecy, as though every locked cabinet concealed not diplomatic records but revelations that could shatter faith itself. Even today, when scholars can access parts of the archives, fascination persists. The official reading rooms, with their strict regulations and limited entry, reinforce the sense of exclusivity. Only a handful of researchers at a time are permitted, and even then, they may request only certain volumes, guided by carefully curated catalogs. For the conspiratorial mind, this is no reassurance but confirmation. If access is so restricted, it must be because the most dangerous documents are kept out of sight, available only to trusted insiders. And who could be more trusted than the Jesuits, Rome's most disciplined servants? Some modern writers go further, weaving tales that stretch into the fantastic. They claim the archives hide not only church records, but also the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, or secret alien manuscripts. In such imaginings, the Jesuits appear not as simple priests but as guardians of esoteric truth, keepers of knowledge too vast for ordinary mortals. In films, novels, and sensational books, the Jesuit archivist has become a stock character, the learned but dangerous priest who knows the truths that could topple civilizations. Yet reality is stranger, if quieter, than fiction. The documents that are accessible reveal an extraordinary panorama of human history. Letters from missionaries describing their encounters with new worlds, decrees that shape the fate of nations, confessions and trials that reveal the fears of past centuries. In these texts, one hears the voices of both the powerful and forgotten, preserved for generations. If the archives are a vault of secrets, they are the secrets of humanity itself, its ambitions, its failures, its struggles for faith and power. Still, the Jesuit connection ensures that the aura of mystery will never fully vanish. For those inclined to suspicion, the very presence of Jesuit reports in the archives is proof that the order controls history itself, editing the past to suit its designs. And for storytellers, the image of a Jesuit scholar unlocking a forbidden cabinet will always be too irresistible to ignore. Whether in truth or legend, the forbidden archives remain a symbol of hidden knowledge, and the Jesuits, whether as stewards, scholars, or shadows, remain at the heart of the mystery. The truth is that the archives do not need grails or prophesies to inspire awe. The sheer weight of history within those walls is enough to stir the imagination. But because the human mind hungers for more than facts, legends grow in the gaps of knowledge. And so long as the doors remain closed to most, the forbidden archives will continue to inspire whispers in which the Jesuits always seem to play the central role. The 18th century was not kind to the Society of Jesus. What had begun in the 16th century as a daring brotherhood of missionaries, educators, and confessors to kings had, by the Age of Enlightenment, become one of the most mistrusted institutions in Europe. Their reputation for discipline, secrecy, and influence, once their greatest strength, had turned into a source of fear. Monarchs whispered that Jesuits controlled their thrones. Intellectuals accused them of stifling reason. Rivals within the church claimed they were more loyal to their general than to the Pope himself. And so, one of the most extraordinary episodes in church history unfolded, the suppression of the Jesuits. The drama began with growing hostility from European courts. In Portugal, King José I and his powerful minister, the Marquis of Pombal, accused the Jesuit of meddling in colonial affairs, resisting royal authority, and even plotting assassination. In 1759, under Pombal's orders, the Jesuits were expelled from Portugal and its vast overseas empire. Priests were rounded up, schools closed, and missionaries driven from Brazil, India, and Africa. Ships carried them away under guard, symbols of a new age in which kings no longer tolerated what they saw as a rival power within their realms. Spain soon followed. In 1767, under King Charles III, thousands of Jesuits were dragged from their homes in a single night. Witnesses described the shock of priests awakened by soldiers, given only moments to gather their belongings, and marched away in silence. From Spain, the purge extended to Naples, Parma, and other Bourbon realms. The Jesuits were shipped like criminals across the Mediterranean, eventually deposited on the papal state shores. It was as if the monarchs of Europe had conspired to erase the order from their domains in one sweeping gesture. France, too, turned against them. Enlightenment thinkers railed against Jesuit obscurantism and their alleged stranglehold on education. When a scandal involving Jesuit missions in the Caribbean gave the Parliament of Paris an excuse, the French crown expelled the order in 1764. By the 1770s, the Jesuits had been driven from almost every Catholic kingdom. What had once been the Church's most energetic missionary force was now an exiled body, scattered and disgraced. The final blow came from within the Vatican itself. Pressured by Bourbon monarchs, Pope Clement XIV signed the Brief Dominus AC Redemptor in 1773, formally suppressing the Society of Jesus worldwide. The order ceased to exist in the eyes of the Church. Jesuit houses were closed, their property confiscated, their schools taken over by diocesan clergy or rival orders. Priests who had once walked with princes now found themselves wandering in exile, forbidden even to use the name Society of Jesus. It was an astonishing reversal of fortune. For their enemies, it was a triumph, the fall of the black-robed army they had so long feared. For the Jesuits themselves, it was a test of endurance unlike any they had ever faced. They had sworn obedience, poverty, and chastity, but now they were asked to endure humiliation, displacement, and invisibility. And yet, even in suppression, the Jesuits did not vanish. In some places, rulers refused to enforce the papal decree. Catherine the Great of Russia, eager to use Jesuit expertise in education, allowed them to continue their schools. In Prussia, Frederick the Great likewise sheltered exiled Jesuits, reasoning that their talents in teaching and administration were too valuable to lose. Thus, pockets of the order survived in the very lands least expected, under Protestant and Orthodox monarchs, rather than Catholic ones. This survival became the seed of their eventual revival. While the name Jesuit was outlawed, the spirit of the society endured. Former Jesuits continued to write, teach, and advise in private. Their network remained quietly intact. Letters passed between exiles in Italy, Russia, and Prussia, carrying news, encouragement, and sometimes instructions. It was as though an underground order persisted in the shadows, waiting for the day it could step back into the light. The aura of mystery surrounding the Jesuits only deepened during these years. Enemies claimed they were secretly plotting their restoration, working behind the scenes to manipulate courts and papal politics. Pamphlets spoke of Jesuit generals who still issued commands from hidden houses. The Black Pope, it was said, still held his silent court, ruling an invisible empire. Whether true or not, such tales gave the impression that the Jesuits were indestructible, that even when officially dissolved, they somehow lived on. For ordinary members, however, survival was often a matter of endurance rather than intrigue. Many former Jesuits had to find new livelihoods, teaching under secular titles, serving as parish priests, or even taking humble jobs. Some continued their missionary work under other names. Others fell into obscurity, their dreams of lifelong service cut short. Their letters revealed deep sorrow, but also a stubborn resilience, the conviction that their work had been for God, not for kings or popes, and that someday justice would return. When Pope Pius VII finally restored the society in 1814, the revival seemed nothing short of miraculous. After 4 decades in the wilderness, the Jesuits emerged alive, though scarred. The exiled members who had kept the flame alive in Russia and Prussia became the foundation for a new generation. Their return was met with both relief and suspicion. Relief from those who welcomed their talents, suspicion from those who remembered the reason for their suppression. The suppression and survival of the Jesuits left a deep imprint on their identity. They had learned the fragility of power, the danger of too much influence, and the bitterness of exile. But they had also learned that resilience and faith could sustain them through the darkest of times. Their enemies had sought to erase them from history, but in the attempt, they had made the Jesuits more mysterious than ever. To the public imagination, they became not merely a religious order but a force that could not be destroyed, a brotherhood whose survival hinted at some hidden strength, some secret knowledge that even kings could not crush. And so, in the shadows of suppression, the legend of the Jesuits grew. Were they truly crushed, or had they found ways to continue their mission unseen? Did the Black Pope remain in exile, waiting for his hour? These questions lingered long after the order's official restoration, feeding the myth that the Jesuits, like the archives they were said to guard, could never truly be silenced. Prophecy has always clung to the Jesuits like a shadow, whispering of destinies written long before their rise and of fates entwined with the end of empires. From their earliest days, the order seemed surrounded by predictions, some hopeful, others ominous. To admirers, Jesuit missionaries were heralds of a coming age of global Christianity. To their enemies, they were the agents of a darker plan, foretold in cryptic verses and medieval warnings that hinted at domination, corruption, and even apocalypse. One of the most frequently cited prophecies came from a name steeped in legend, Nostradamus. Though much of his cryptic writing could be twisted to fit almost any event, certain interpreters insisted that his quatrain spoke of a black-robed order that would weave its influence across kings and peoples, shaping destinies behind veils of secrecy. Whether he meant the Jesuits or not, the image took hold. In an age already primed to fear the order's invisible power, Nostradamus became a weapon for their critics. His words were read aloud in taverns and salons, convincing many that the Jesuits were not just powerful, they were prophesied. Others supposed prophecies came from within the Church itself. Medieval seers had spoken of a black pope who would rise when the Church grew corrupt, a rival to the white-robed pontiff, sowing confusion and gathering immense sway. In times of tension, during the suppression, the Counter-Reformation, or the upheavals of revolution, pamphleteers resurrected these old lines and pointed their fingers at the Jesuit general. How else to explain his strange authority, his whispered title of Papa Nero? To the faithful, these prophecies became warning signs. To the conspiratorial, they were confirmation of secret schemes unfolding exactly as foretold. In the Jesuit missions abroad, stories of prophecy took on an even stranger character. Letters from China, India, and the Americas carried tales of local prophecies that seemed to anticipate the coming of foreign priests. In some villages, elders greeted Jesuit missionaries as figures foretold by their ancestors. In others, rumors spread that the Jesuits themselves carried forbidden knowledge of the stars, the seasons, and even the end of days. Their mastery of mathematics, astronomy, and languages only deepened this aura. A priest who could predict an eclipse seemed, to many, like a man who held divine secrets, or dark ones. Enemies of the order seized on these stories, weaving them into apocalyptic warnings. Protestant polemicists in the 17th century declared that the Jesuits were not merely priests but instruments of the Antichrist. They cited the Book of Revelation, suggesting that the beast that rose from the earth was none other than the Society of Jesus, born to deceive nations and enslave souls. The idea of a Jesuit as a prophesied villain caught on, especially in England and Germany, where suspicion of Rome was already high. The whispered prophecy of the Black Pope thus became a recurring motif, a figure who lurked in shadows, whose rise would herald an age of tyranny disguised as faith. But prophecy is never one-sided. Within Jesuit circles, there were also whispers of destiny, not of doom, but of divine mission. Some members spoke of the order as the spearhead of God's plan, chosen to carry the gospel to the ends of the earth. They saw the suppression and survival of society as proof that they were destined to endure, like the early church, persecuted yet unbroken. In private journals, Jesuits compared their ordeals to biblical trials, interpreting exile as a prelude to renewal. For them, prophecy was not a curse but a source of strength, a reminder that their suffering was woven into a larger divine design. Still, ambiguity clung to these visions. Even sympathetic mystics hinted at troubling fates. Some suggested that the Jesuits would one day face betrayal from within, their greatest threat arising not from monarchs or popes but from their own ranks. Others claimed that the order's fall and rebirth were only steps in a larger cycle, one that might end in a cataclysm. Such warnings blurred the line between promise and peril, leaving the Jesuits both exalted and haunted by what the future might hold. The 19th century, with its fascination for secret societies and occult prophecy, gave new life to these tales. Books and pamphlets emerged claiming that hidden Jesuit prophecies foretold revolutions, assassinations, even world wars. Some writers insisted that deep in the Vatican archives lay documents revealing the Jesuits' ultimate plan, timelines predicting the collapse of monarchies and the rise of a global order under their watch. These claims, however fanciful, spread like wildfire in an age that already feared invisible conspiracies. Even in modern times, the legend of Jesuit prophecy has not died. Every papal election revives speculation about whether the Black Pope has finally risen, whether the Society of Jesus will step from the shadows to lead the Church, or to divide it. The election of Pope Francis, the first Jesuit pope in history, reignited these questions with renewed intensity. Was his rise a fulfillment of ancient predictions? Had the line between the White Pope and the Black Pope finally blurred into one? For many, the event felt like prophecy come to life, though interpretations varied between triumph and dread. What is striking is not whether any of these prophecies are true, but how deeply they have shaped the myth of the Jesuits. They cast the order as more than human actors, making them symbols of destiny itself. Whether viewed as saviors or deceivers, the Jesuits became a vessel into which societies poured their hopes and fears about the future. Prophecy gave the order an aura of inevitability. Whatever happened, it had already been written. And so, the whispered prophecies remain, threading through centuries of suspicion and faith. They cannot be disproved, for prophecy thrives on ambiguity. They cannot be silenced, for every crisis gives them new life. Whether born of fear, admiration, or imagination, these predictions ensure that the Jesuits will always be seen not only as priests and scholars, but as figures of destiny, actors in a drama written long ago, yet still unfolding in shadows. By the 19th century, the Society of Jesus had risen from its ashes. Restored by papal decree in 1814, the Jesuits found themselves entering a new battlefield, not one of swords or gunpowder, but of influence. In an age of revolutions, rising nationalism, and the clash between tradition and modernity, the Jesuits became both champions of Catholic revival and targets of fierce suspicion. This struggle, fought in schools, parliaments, newspapers, and pulpits, became known in some circles as the Jesuit Wars of Influence, a conflict without armies yet marked by victories, betrayals, and fears of domination. Education was their first weapon. The Jesuits returned to their old strength: schools, colleges, and universities. From Rome to Paris, from Madrid to Warsaw, they rebuilt networks of elite education that once again drew the sons of nobles, merchants, and even politicians. In their classrooms, young men learned not only Latin and rhetoric, but discipline, logic, and Catholic doctrine. Critics accused the Jesuits of shaping future leaders in their own mold, planting seeds of obedience to Rome. Admirers countered that their teaching created disciplined, moral leaders in a chaotic age. The classroom thus became the first front in the wars of influence. But education was not their only tool. The Jesuits also excelled in publishing. They produced journals, pamphlets, and books that defended Catholic orthodoxy against liberal and secular ideologies. In France, journals such as Etude became influential voices in political debates. In Italy and Spain, Jesuit presses churned out apologetics and counter-revolutionary tracts. Wherever liberal newspapers criticized the Church, Jesuit writers answered with eloquence and fire. This constant duel of words gave the impression of an order engaged in an endless propaganda war, one that spilled from the pulpit into the very heart of public life. Governments, already wary, reacted with alarm. In France, the July monarchy and later the Third Republic waged open battles against Jesuit schools. Laws were passed restricting religious education, sometimes forcing the order underground. In Germany, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck launched the Kulturkampf, a culture struggle meant to curb Catholic influence. Jesuits were singled out as dangerous agents of Rome and expelled from German lands in 1872. Bismarck declared them enemies of the modern state, accusing them of plotting against national unity. The order responded by sending its expelled members abroad, where they continued their work, sometimes with even greater success. This pattern repeated across Europe. In Spain and Portugal, anti-clerical governments closed Jesuit institutions. In Switzerland, where liberal reforms swept through cantons, Jesuits were banned altogether. Yet every attempt to suppress them seemed to feed their mystique. The exiled priests became martyrs in the eyes of Catholic families, their absence proof of the state's fear of truth. Thus, persecution often strengthened the very devotion it sought to weaken. Nor were the Jesuit wars confined to Europe. In Latin America, where the Jesuits had left deep roots during their colonial missions, they returned to find themselves caught between church and revolution. New republics, eager to assert independence from Rome, often expelled or restricted Jesuit influence. Yet Catholic populations clung to their schools and parishes, ensuring the order's survival even amid hostility. In Mexico, Argentina, and Chile, the Jesuits faced alternating waves of suppression and welcome, depending on whether governments leaned liberal or conservative. The United States presented a different theater. There, Jesuits built colleges such as Georgetown and Boston College, shaping generations of American Catholics. Yet suspicion lingered. Anti-Catholic movements like the Know-Nothings denounced Jesuit schools as foreign infiltrations. Conspiracy books flourished, claiming that Jesuits sought to turn America into a papal state. Some even argue that Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated at Jesuit instigation, claims without evidence, but powerful in shaping public fears. In the American imagination, the Jesuit became both a respected teacher and a lurking conspirator. The wars of influence were not only external. Within the Church itself, debates raged over how far Jesuit authority should extend. Other religious orders accused them of arrogance and domination. Bishops sometimes clashed with Jesuit educators who wielded more influence over youth than local dioceses. Even popes alternated between reliance and caution, using the Jesuits as defenders of doctrine but warning them against overreach. The tension between service and power, obedience and ambition, remained at the heart of the order's identity. What made the Jesuits so enduring in these wars was their adaptability. When schools were shut, they taught in private homes. When presses were censored, they smuggled writings across borders. When governments expelled them, they found refuge in distant lands, often turning exile into opportunity. Their global network ensured that no single suppression could end their influence. A Jesuit expelled from Germany might teach in America. One driven from France might serve in Africa. The very mobility of the order became a weapon in its quiet war. And always, behind their survival, lurked the figure of a general, the so-called Black Pope. Conspiracy theorists claimed he directed these battles like a general commanding armies, shifting resources, moving men like chess pieces across the map of Europe and beyond. In reality, much depended on local initiative, but the myth of central command only deepened fears. It seemed to confirm what critics had always claimed, that the Jesuits fought not for faith alone, but for domination under a shadowy ruler. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Jesuits had emerged scarred but unbroken. They had lost battles, whole countries had driven them out, but they had won others, ensuring their survival and continuing to shape minds across continents. The wars of influence were not fought in decisive clashes, but in countless small struggles. A law passed, a school reopened, a pamphlet circulated, a student inspired. And in these small victories, the Jesuits demonstrated their greatest strength, persistence. To their enemies, this persistence looked like conspiracy. To their supporters, it looked like faithfulness. Either way, the Jesuits remained impossible to ignore. They were not an army, yet they fought like one. They held no throne, yet their influence rivaled monarchs. And as the 19th century closed, the wars of influence left one undeniable truth. The Society of Jesus could never again be underestimated. The struggle was far from over. Ahead lay revolutions, world wars, and modern ideologies that would test the Jesuits in new ways. But the lessons of the 19th century had been burned into their identity. Suppression had failed. Exile had failed. Fear had failed. The Jesuits had learned to turn every weapon used against them into a source of resilience. And in the shadows of these battles, the legend of the Black Pope endured, a reminder that behind the quiet wars of influence, many still believed a hidden hand was guiding history. As the 20th century dawned, the world entered an age of mass communication, rapid political change, and global wars. The Jesuits, who had survived centuries of exile and suppression, now found themselves in a new battlefield, the imagination of modern society. No longer were suspicions confined to pulpits or parliamentary debates. Instead, newspapers, radio broadcasts, political pamphlets, and later the Internet carried their name into countless homes, turning the Society of Jesus into one of the most recognized, yet most misunderstood, religious orders in history. Conspiracies multiplied, taking on new shapes to match the anxieties of modern times. One of the oldest accusations, that the Jesuits sought world domination, remained alive, but it adapted to new political climates. In the age of fascism and communism, conspiracy writers claimed that the Jesuits were secretly orchestrating these movements despite their conflicting ideologies. Some accused them of being the hidden hand behind Mussolini's Italy, pointing to the Vatican's concordat with the fascist regime as evidence. Others declared that Jesuits had engineered communism itself, citing the presence of Catholic intellectuals in revolutionary circles. The sheer contradiction, that the order could be both fascist and communist, did little to slow the rumors. For critics, the Jesuits were capable of anything, masters of deception who could wear any mask to achieve their aims. The Jesuit connection to assassinations and political upheavals also persisted. In America, the lingering claim that Abraham Lincoln's assassination had been arranged by Jesuit agents resurfaced during times of political division. Later, conspiracy theorists tied the order to the death of President John F. Kennedy, arguing that his Catholic faith and independent streak had made him dangerous to Rome. These theories, unsupported by evidence, nevertheless flourished in pamphlets and underground publications, feeding the suspicion that Jesuits operated as assassins as well as educators. The two world wars provided fertile ground for new layers of conspiracy. During World War I, some accused the Jesuit of encouraging Catholic soldiers to resist Protestant officers, while others claimed they had betrayed nations to the Vatican. In World War II, the situation became more tangled. Some argued the Jesuits had supported Hitler, pointing to the Vatican's initial attempts to negotiate with Nazi Germany. Others accused them of being key actors in resistance movements, particularly in Poland and France, where Jesuits risked their lives to shelter Jews and oppose fascism. This contradiction, the orders simultaneously accused of collaboration and resistance, revealed how easily they could be molded into whichever role suited the storyteller's fate. In the Cold War era, the Jesuits once again became the subject of dual conspiracies. To conservative critics, they were infiltrators who had embraced Marxism through movements like liberation theology in Latin America. Priests who championed the poor and opposed U.S.-backed dictatorships were branded as communist agents in disguise. Meanwhile, on the left, some suspected Jesuits of secretly supporting authoritarian regimes in order to maintain Catholic dominance. To one side they were too radical, to the other they were too reactionary. Both accusations kept alive the idea that the Jesuits operated not as a religious order but as a shadowy cabal playing both ends against the middle. The media boom of the 20th century amplified these suspicions. Books such as The Secret History of the Jesuits by Edmund Paris portrayed the order as a manipulative organization behind wars and revolutions. Protestant writers, especially in America, reissued pamphlets warning that Jesuits sought to subvert democracy and install papal rule. Some of these works recycled centuries-old myths. Jesuits as confessors manipulating monarchs, Jesuits as poisoners, Jesuits as plotters of world conquest. But in the modern setting, these stories reach far wider audiences, blending old fears with contemporary paranoia. Conspiracies also took root in popular culture. Novels, thrillers, and later films often portrayed Jesuits as mysterious figures guarding secrets or plotting global domination. They became convenient villains, educated, disciplined, and mysterious, yet cloaked in enough real history to give fictional plots of a near truth. Even when portrayed sympathetically, they were rarely shown as ordinary priests. The aura of secrecy clung to them, ensuring that they remained figures of intrigue rather than mere servants of the Church. The rise of the Internet in the late 20th century gave new life to Jesuit conspiracies. Online forums and websites dedicated to uncovering hidden powers frequently included the Jesuits alongside Freemasons, Illuminati, and secret government agencies. Diagrams circulated showing the Jesuit superior general, the so-called Black Pope, at the top of a pyramid of world control, with politicians, bankers, and intelligence agencies beneath him. Videos and articles claimed that every major world event, from the moon landing to 9/11, could be traced back to Jesuit manipulation. The very structure of the Jesuit Order, with its vows of obedience and its global network, made it easy to imagine them as the ultimate secret society. Perhaps the most enduring symbol in modern conspiracies remained the figure of the Black Pope. Dressed in simple black robes, the superior general was said to wield more power than the actual pope, directing global politics from the shadows. While in reality the role was largely administrative, guiding the order's missions, education, and spiritual work, the myth refused to die. Every new superior general, from Pedro Arup to Arturo Sosa, inherited not only leadership of the order but also the suspicion that he was a hidden ruler of the world. Yet the persistence of these conspiracies reveals more about society than about the Jesuits themselves. They thrived because the order embodied qualities that frightened or fascinated the modern imagination: secrecy, discipline, intelligence, and global reach. In an age when institutions were distrusted and elites were blamed for hidden agendas, the Jesuits seemed to fit perfectly into the role of shadowy manipulators. To their enemies, they were the face of hidden control. To their supporters, they were scapegoats of the world's paranoia. Ironically, the Jesuits of the 20th century were often more divided and less powerful than their critics believed. Debates over theology, politics, and the role of the Church in modern society sometimes split the order internally. Their commitment to education and social justice brought them into conflict with both secular governments and conservative factions within Catholicism. Far from being a unified cabal controlling the world, they were an order wrestling with how to remain faithful in a rapidly changing age. But conspiracy theories rarely acknowledge complexity. They thrive on simplicity, a single enemy, hidden but powerful, controlling what seems uncontrollable. As the century closed, the Jesuits had become a paradox of modern conspiracies. They were accused of orchestrating wars while also being celebrated for peace work. They were said to control governments while also being persecuted by them. They were portrayed as assassins and as martyrs, villains and heroes, tyrants and liberators. The truth was always more complicated, but the myths ensured that the Society of Jesus remained one of the most mysterious and controversial organizations in modern history. By the time the Internet age matured, Jesuit conspiracies had woven themselves into a broader tapestry of global paranoia. Whether linked to the Illuminati, the Bilderberg Group, or the Vatican itself, the Jesuits were always near the top of the imagined hierarchy of hidden rulers. The wars of influence had given way to a digital battlefield, where memes, blogs, and viral videos replaced pamphlets and sermons. And in this new arena, the Jesuits continue to occupy a strange place, both respected as educators and reviled as supposed manipulators of world events. The modern conspiracies show that while the world has changed dramatically since the Order's founding in 1540, the human tendency to fear secret power remains the same. The Jesuits, with their blend of real influence and imagined intrigue, continue to serve as a mirror for society's deepest anxieties. Whether seen as offenders of faith or architects of deception, they endure in the modern imagination not just as priests, but as symbols of mystery itself. Among all the conspiracies surrounding the Jesuits, none has proven more enduring or more evocative than the legend of the Black Pope. The term itself conjures images of shadows moving behind thrones, of a hidden pontiff dressed not in papal white but in austere black robes, secretly pulling the strings of both church and state. For centuries, writers and critics have whispered that the Jesuit superior general, elected by the order's own priests, holds more power than the Pope himself. To many, he is the ultimate hidden ruler, commanding obedience not only from his brothers but also from kings, presidents, and the Vatican's white-clad pontiff. But how much of this is truth, and how much is a mythology of fae? The title Black Pope does not appear in any Jesuit records. It was a label coined by outsiders, critics who saw in the Jesuit superior general an uncanny mirror of papal authority. Like the Pope, he is elected for life. Like the Pope, he commands loyalty from a global body. And like the Pope, he resides in Rome, close to the seat of Catholic power. But while the Pope wears white robes as a symbol of purity, the Jesuit general wears the simple black cassock of his order. From this contrast, the myth was born, the Pope in white for the visible church, and the Pope in black for the hidden one. To understand the allure of this myth, one must grasp the extraordinary structure of the Jesuit Order. Unlike many religious groups that function more loosely, the Society of Jesus is marked by its tight organization and its unique vow of obedience. A Jesuit does not simply pledge loyalty to God and the Church. He also promises absolute obedience to the Pope regarding missions, and to Superior General in all matters of order and discipline. This hierarchical unity, admired by some, appeared sinister to others. If thousands of intelligent, disciplined men obeyed one Superior General, then surely, critics reasoned, that man must wield immense power. The secrecy surrounding Jesuit decision-making only added to the mystique. The election of a new superior general takes place in Rome behind closed doors, with delegates from around the world gathering in what is called a general congregation. The deliberations are private, and the chosen leader emerges suddenly, as if from the shadows, to assume his post for life. To conspiracy theorists, such rituals seem more like the choosing of a secret king than the governance of a religious community. Each new superior general inherited not only the task of guiding his order, but also the suspicion that he was now the most dangerous man in the Vatican. Historically, some superiors general did indeed wield influence that matched the myth. Claudio Acquaviva, who led the order for over 3 decades in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, directed Jesuit involvement in education, missions, and politics across Europe and beyond. His guidance shaped kings, scholars, and missionaries, leading many to believe that the Jesuit general could orchestrate events on a continental scale. Later, in the 20th century, leaders like Pedro Arrupe became prominent voices in debates about justice, war, and the Church's role in the modern world. Their visibility reinforced the notion that the general was not just a religious figure, but a global actor. Yet the reality of the position is far more complex than the myths suggest. The superior general's authority, though broad within the society, is not absolute. He oversees the spiritual health of the order, the placement of its members, and the general direction of its works. But he is also accountable to the Pope and to the general congregations that can, in theory, correct or even depose him. His decisions are often constrained by finances, politics, and the autonomy of local provinces. Far from being a puppet master, the general frequently finds himself negotiating between competing priorities, balancing the order's educational mission, its pastoral commitments, and its loyalty to Rome. Nevertheless, the myth persists because the Jesuits themselves, through their work, seem to embody the qualities one would expect from a secret world power: intelligence, discretion, global presence, and resilience in the face of adversity. Their schools and universities continue to educate political leaders. Their priests serve in missions and parishes on nearly every continent, and their scholarship shapes both Catholic theology and secular thought. From the outside, it is easy to imagine that such a disciplined network could be marshaled by a single commanding figure to achieve hidden ends. The myth of the Black Pope also thrives because it speaks to a universal fear that visible leaders are merely figureheads, while real decisions are made in secret. In politics, in business, in religion, people are drawn to the idea of hidden rulers who explain the mysteries of power. The Jesuit general, with his simple black robes and his hidden elections, fits neatly into this psychological pattern. To critics, he is proof that the Vatican's smiling public face conceals a darker reality. To storytellers, he is a perfect villain, the shadow behind the throne. Modern conspiracy theories have amplified this legend to almost fantastical heights. Some internet writers claim that the Black Pope outranks even the Pope, directing not just the Catholic Church but also the Freemasons, world banks, intelligence agencies, and governments. They circulate charts with the Jesuit general's name at the top, placing him above presidents and monarchs. Others suggest that world events, from revolutions to assassinations, are carried out on his orders. These claims, often wildly exaggerated or entirely fabricated, nevertheless draw power from the centuries-old suspicion that the Jesuits are never quite what they seem. And yet, the reality of the Black Pope today is almost anticlimactic compared to the myth. The current Superior General, Arturo Sosa, spends much of his time addressing issues of education, poverty, climate change, and the internal needs of the order. He is not a shadow ruler commanding armies, but an administrator, a pastor, and a thinker tasked with guiding an order through the challenges of a fractured world. His authority is respected but limited. His life, far from cloaked in luxury or secret power, is marked by endless meetings, correspondence, and travel. If he is a ruler, it is in the quiet sense of shepherding rather than in the dramatic sense of commanding. Still, the myth refuses to die, and perhaps it never will. For myths are not extinguished by facts. They live on because they satisfy emotional needs. The Black Pope endures because he embodies the tension between the seen and the unseen, between the official story and the imagined truth. In a world where so much remains uncertain, people cling to figures who seem to explain the mysteries of power, even if those explanations are built on shadows. Thus, the story of the Black Pope is not merely a tale about the Jesuits. It is a tale about us. It reveals our fascination with secrecy, our fear of hidden rulers, and our hunger for simple answers to complex realities. The Superior General of the Jesuits is, in truth, a priest, a leader, and a servant of his order. But in the imagination of millions, he is something more, the shadow ruler of the Vatican, the unseen hand guiding history. Whether that is fact or fiction matters less than the power of the story itself, a story that has haunted the Jesuits for centuries and shows no sign of fading in the modern age. From the very beginning of their history, the Jesuits have existed in a space that blurs the lines between reality and myth. They are at once educators, missionaries, and pastors, and at the same time, in the imagination of critics, spies, assassins, and shadow rulers. Few religious orders have attracted such admiration and suspicion in equal measure. And at the center of this paradox lies the question, why do stories about the Jesuits persist even when facts contradict them? The answer begins with the nature of the Jesuit Order itself. Unlike other religious communities that emphasize separation from the world, the Jesuits entered directly into the heart of society. They sought out schools, courts, palaces, and universities. They engaged with politics, science, exploration, and culture. This very engagement created the conditions for suspicion. Where monks secluded themselves in monasteries, Jesuits appeared in royal courts. Where friars preached in small towns, Jesuits taught in universities that produced future rulers. Their very visibility made them vulnerable to conspiracy, for it is always easy to fear those who stand close to power. But suspicion alone cannot explain centuries of myth. What gives the Jesuit legend its force is the interplay of fact and fiction. At times, Jesuits truly did wield influence that frightened their opponents. They did advise monarchs. They did run vast networks of schools. They did cultivate obedience within their ranks. These realities gave the conspirators a seed of credibility. The fiction grew from the soil of fact, exaggerating, twisting, and reinterpreting until the ordinary became extraordinary. The story of the Black Pope exemplifies this process. Yes, the Jesuit superior general leads a global order with a centralized structure. Yes, he commands loyalty and directs missions across continents. But the leap from these realities to the image of a secret ruler controlling world events is vast. It is not the product of historical evidence, but of psychological need. People crave simple explanation for complex problems. Wars, revolutions, economic crises. These are messy, chaotic, and often without clear cause. To say the Jesuits are behind it is to impose order on chaos. The myth becomes a comfort, even if it is rooted in fear. There is also the allure of secrecy. The Jesuits, by their own design, cloak much of their decision-making in privacy. Their internal debates, their elections, their methods of discernment, all of these are shielded from the public eye. Secrecy protects the integrity of the order, but it also feeds the imagination of outsiders. What is hidden is often assumed to be dangerous. The locked door, the closed meeting, the unseen ritual, these become fertile ground for suspicion. When the Jesuits say, "This is private," critics say, "This is sinister." The tension between fact and fiction has persisted into the modern age. For every Jesuit scholar publishing respected works in philosophy or science, there is a conspiracy theorist linking the order to global domination. For every Jesuit missionary feeding the poor in the developing world, there is a rumor that the order controls international banks. These contradictions are not accidents. They reveal how myths adapt to fit the needs of different societies. In Protestant England of the 17th century, Jesuits were imagined as assassins. In Cold War America, they were accused of communist sympathies. In the Internet age, they are said to be the mastermind behind world government. Each era reshapes the same story for its own fears. This persistence tells us as much about human psychology as it does about the Jesuits themselves. People are drawn to hidden enemies. We want to believe that the chaos of the world can be explained by a single secret force. It is easier to imagine that Jesuits control history than to accept that history is often the product of chance, conflict, and human error. The Jesuits, with their discipline, education, and global reach, offer the perfect canvas onto which these fears can be painted. And yet, to dismiss all suspicion as mere paranoia would be too simple. The Jesuits have not always been innocent. Their closeness to power has sometimes led to abuses, arrogance, and mistakes. They have been expelled from countries not only because of prejudice, but also because of political entanglements. Their obedience, so admired by some, has at times made them agents of policies that harmed others. The truth is that the Jesuit story is not one of saints or villains, but of human beings navigating faith and power in a complicated world. The enduring enigma, then, is not whether the Jesuits are good or evil, but why we continue to see them through the lens of mystery. Perhaps it is because they remind us of the double-edged nature of human institutions. Knowledge can enlighten, but it can also manipulate. Discipline can create unity, but it can also suppress. Influence can be used for justice, but it can also be abused. The Jesuits embody this tension, and in them we see a reflection of our own fears about authority, secrecy, and control. This is why the legend of the Black Pope still fascinates. Whether one sees him as a shadow ruler or as a misunderstood priest, he embodies the human struggle with the unseen forces that shape our lives. We fear what we cannot see, and we imagine that behind every curtain there must be a puppeteer. The Black Pope is less a man than a symbol, the embodiment of our suspicion that someone, somewhere, knows more than we do and holds the strings we cannot see. In the end, the Jesuits remain an enigma because they live in both worlds, the world of fact and the world of fiction. They are real men who teach, pray, and serve. And they are also characters in a story that will never die, a story woven from fear, awe, and imagination. To study them is to confront not only their history, but also our own tendency to create myths from shadows. As we close this journey into their world, one question lingers. What does it say about us that we need the Jesuits to be more than they are? Perhaps it says that mystery is essential to human life. We do not live only by facts, but also by stories. And in the Jesuits, we find a story rich enough to carry both admiration and suspicion across centuries. And so the Black Pope remains, part truth, part fiction, entirely human, and yet larger than life. Whether he is a shadow ruler or merely a misunderstood leader matters less than the reality that he will always symbolize the unseen, the unknown, and the enduring hunger for answers in a world full of questions. As we emerge from centuries of myth, conspiracy, and history, the figure of the Black Pope offers more than intrigue. It offers a lens through which to examine power, secrecy, and human nature itself. The Jesuit superior general, whether viewed as a shadow ruler or devoted priest, embodies lessons that stretch far beyond the Vatican walls. To understand the significance of the Black Pope, one must look not only at the man or the order, but at the stories we tell ourselves about hidden authority, influence, and the enduring tension between faith and fear. At its core, the legend of the Black Pope teaches us about the allure of the unseen. Humans are drawn to mystery. We instinctively fear what we cannot understand, yet we are equally fascinated by it. For centuries, the secrecy surrounding Jesuit elections, internal deliberations, and global networks created a perfect canvas for imagination. Outsiders assumed that what was hidden must be sinister or omnipotent. Yet the reality is more mundane. The order's internal secrecy exists primarily to maintain discipline, unity, and spiritual focus. Still, the gap between perception and reality demonstrates how easily the unknown can become a symbol of power, both feared and respected. The story of the Black Pope also reveals how influence is perceived differently depending on context. To monarchs in the 16th and 17th centuries, Jesuit advisors seemed omnipotent because their counsel often shaped political decisions and education. To Enlightenment thinkers, they appeared oppressive because the order resisted secular rationalism. In the modern era, their global network, educational reach, and social engagement fuel conspiracy theories that portray them as orchestrators of world events. Influence, in short, is never neutral. It is interpreted through the lens of fear, admiration, or suspicion. The Black Pope, therefore, teaches us that power is as much about perception as it is about actual control. Another lesson lies in resilience. The Jesuits endured suppression, exile, and accusations of conspiracy, yet they survived and even thrived. The order's ability to adapt, teaching in new lands, establishing schools, engaging in social justice, demonstrates a remarkable capacity for endurance. The myth of the Black Pope magnifies this resilience, transforming ordinary perseverance into legendary tenacity. In a world where institutions rise and fall, the Jesuits show that survival depends not only on strength but also on strategy, adaptability, and faith in one's mission. The Black Pope also invites reflection on the human fascination with conspiracy. Theories about Jesuits illustrate a broader truth. We often seek hidden explanations for complex events. Wars, political upheavals, and cultural shifts can feel chaotic, threatening, and incomprehensible. It is easier to imagine a single shadowy figure orchestrating events than to accept randomness, error, or collective human decision-making. The myth of the Black Pope serves as a mirror, revealing our need to impose order on uncertainty and to locate causality in a figure we can visualize, even if that figure is more imagined than real. At the same time, the figure of the Black Pope challenges simplistic notions of morality. He is depicted alternately as villain and hero, conspirator and savior. This duality reflects the complexity of human institutions. An organization can do great good and still inspire suspicion. Jesuits educate and serve, yet their presence near power has always generated fear. Their history teaches that morality and influence are never one-dimensional. The myth of the Black Pope, by exaggerating extremes, highlights this tension, reminding us that the line between admiration and fear is often thin. The legend also underscores the power of narrative. Across centuries, stories of Jesuit manipulation, exile, prophecy, and survival have been passed from pamphlet to books, from newspapers to the internet. Each generation reinterprets the order according to its fears, values, and knowledge. This ongoing narrative reinforces a notion that history is not merely a record of events, but also a story shaped by perspective, imagination, and human psychology. The Black Pope is both subject and symbol within this story, a figure whose meaning evolves as society evolves. In a spiritual sense, the Black Pope also embodies a tension between obedience and conscience. Jesuits take a vow of obedience that is unique in its scope, promising fidelity to the Pope and the orders general. Critics interpret this as a concentration of power. Supporters see it as a discipline that enables purpose, focus, and unity. The vow itself becomes a lens through which to explore the nature of commitment, responsibility, and leadership. It teaches that authority is not inherently dangerous. It is the human choices surrounding authority that determine its moral impact. The myth and reality of the Black Pope further illustrate how symbols endure longer than facts. While the Jesuit superior general may not secretly rule the world, the legend continues because it satisfies a deep human craving for meaning, order, and explanation. Myths endure when they resonate with universal themes: secrecy, power, destiny, and resilience. The Black Pope is more than an individual. He is a symbol of humanity's fascination with hidden authority and the mysteries that govern our lives. Finally, the Black Pope invites reflection on history itself. Throughout centuries, the Jesuits have intersected with pivotal events: the Counter-Reformation, colonial expansion, revolutions, world wars, and modern social movements. Their role has been complex, sometimes controversial, always influential in ways both subtle and direct. Studying the order and the myths that surround it teaches that history is rarely black and white. Influence, intention, and perception intertwine, creating legacies that are part fact, part fiction, and entirely human. As we close this exploration, the enduring lesson of the Black Pope is that mystery and history are intertwined. The Jesuits remind us that human institutions are rarely simple, that influence can be both noble and feared, and that myths persist because they speak to something essential about our need to understand the unseen. They ask us to consider the shadows in our own world, the forces we do not fully comprehend, the authority we do not fully see, and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of it all. Ultimately, the Black Pope is not merely a secret ruler or a figure of conspiracy. He is a symbol of the unknown forces that shape history and human life. He teaches us about faith, resilience, the complexities of influence, and the power of narrative. He reminds us that truth is often laid, that reality and perception coexist, and that our fascination with shadowy figures reveals as much about us as it does about them. And as we step away from the shadows of myth and history, one final question remains. What if the stories we tell about the Black Pope, and by extension, about all unseen power, change the way we see history, authority, and ourselves? The answer lies not in finding a definitive truth, but in the act of reflection itself, in confronting the unknown, in questioning our assumptions, and in recognizing that every shadow has both a story and a lesson waiting to be discovered.